In the middle of a sweltering July night in 1975, a group of firefighters in Hamburg, West Germany, were wrestling with a routine attic fire in a rundown tenement building. The smoke was thick and oily, clinging to their heavy gear as they moved through the cramped upper floor. But as they began to vent the heat, a new sensation hit them. It was a smell so heavy, so cloying, and so sweet that it bypassed their nostrils and seemed to settle directly onto their tongues. One firefighter, gasping for air, swung his heavy iron axe into a hollow-sounding plaster wall to check for hidden embers. Instead of charred wood, the wall gave way to reveal a human hand, pale and perfectly preserved, reaching out from a mountain of industrial salt. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a massive 12-story journey through the dark side of the 1970s. We are going to travel from the streets of Europe to the mountains of Rhodesia and the islands of the Pacific. Before we get started, please consider giving the like button a gentle nudge. It has been working overtime today and probably needs a little positive reinforcement. Just a light tap, nothing crazy. Unlike our first guest today, the like button will not leave a permanent, unexplainable stain on your carpet that you have to explain to your landlord. Also, make sure your doors are bolted, check those window latches, and maybe keep a light on. This is going to be a long one. At 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night in the early 1970s, a man named Fritz Honka was sitting in his usual spot at a dive bar called the Golden Glove in Hamburg's St. Pauli district. Fritz was a man who looked like he had been assembled from broken spare parts. He was barely 5 feet tall with a heavy limp, a mangled nose from a previous car accident, and a profound squint that made him look like he was constantly trying to see through a thick fog. To the other regulars, he was just Fiete. He was the pathetic, quiet laborer who sat in the corner nursing a schnapps and looking for anyone who was even more lonely or forgotten than he was. The St. Pauli district was a place where people went to disappear. It was a labyrinth of neon lights, narrow alleys, and grit. For Fritz, it was the only place he felt he belonged. He lived just a few blocks away in a small, cramped attic apartment on the third floor of a rundown building. His life was defined by a rigid, lonely routine. He would work his shift as a night watchman or a stoker, and then he would head straight to the bar. He was invisible to the world, a ghost in a city that was moving too fast to notice a man who walked with a shuffle and never looked anyone in the eye for more than a second. Fritz's apartment was a reflection of his internal state. It was cluttered, dark, and increasingly difficult to navigate. But to Fritz, it was a sanctuary. He liked the sloping ceilings and the way the shadows gathered in the corners of the attic. He felt safe there, tucked away above the rest of the world. He didn't have many visitors, so he didn't feel the need to keep things tidy. However, as the months turned into years, the space began to change. He started to build things. He added shelves, moved furniture, and eventually he began to modify the very walls of his home, creating small secret voids behind the plaster. In 1970, Fritz met a woman named Anna at the bar. She was older, struggling with her own demons, and looking for a place to rest. Fritz invited her back to his attic, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might finally have found a companion. But Fritz had a darkness inside him that was triggered by the smallest things. When Anna expressed a desire to leave the following morning, something snapped. He didn't just want her to stay, he wanted to ensure she could never leave. After the struggle was over, Fritz was left with a problem that most people would find impossible to solve. But Fritz was a man of cold, mechanical logic. He realized that his attic apartment had plenty of unused space within the structural walls. Using his tools, he opened a section of the knee wall, the short wall that supports the rafters, and placed Anna inside. He didn't just hide her, he treated the space with heavy amounts of industrial salt and pine-scented cleaning agents. He carefully replaced the plaster, smoothed it over, and painted it to match the rest of the room. When he was finished, the wall looked perfectly normal. He sat back down on his bed, lit a cigarette, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was no longer truly alone in his apartment. Over the next few years, this pattern began to repeat. Fritz would find women who were living on the extreme margins of society women the police wouldn't miss and the neighborhood wouldn't ask about. One by one, they would accompany the small, squinting man up the narrow stairs to the third floor, and they would never be seen again. Each time Fritz would perform his grim architectural work, he became an expert at utilizing the voids in his attic, sawing, wrapping, and salting his victims before sealing them away behind fresh plaster. To the outside world, he was still just Fiete, the harmless, lonely man at the bar. But as the count grew to 4 women, the physical reality of what he was doing began to push back against his carefully maintained world. The third floor of the building began to develop an atmosphere. It started as a faint, sweet smell, something that felt like rotting fruit mixed with heavy perfume. Fritz's neighbors, a family named Friedman who lived directly below him, began to notice it first. At night, while they were trying to sleep, they would hear the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floorboards above their heads. It was a slow, rhythmic thud-thud-thud that seemed to go on for hours. Marguerite Friedman, the mother of the family, was the most concerned. She would stand in her kitchen and look up at the ceiling, watching as a strange, brownish liquid began to seep through the light fixtures. When she confronted Fritz in the hallway, he didn't look at her. He just stared at his boots and mumbled that he was cooking a traditional heavy stew that required hours of simmering. He told her the dragging sound was just him moving his heavy furniture around to make room for his hobbies. He was so quiet and seemingly timid that Marguerite felt bad for pestering him. She went back to her apartment and tried to ignore the smell. The smell, however, refused to be ignored. It became a living thing thick enough to make the Friedman children complain of headaches and nausea. Fritz realized he needed a more aggressive solution than just salt. He began to buy boxes of Wunderbaum air fresheners, those little cardboard pine trees you usually see hanging from a rearview mirror. He didn't just buy 1 or 2, he bought hundreds. He hung them from the ceiling of his attic, taped them to the walls, and stuffed them into the cracks of the floorboards. The apartment became a dizzying forest of artificial pine scent, a chemical cloud designed to mask the reality of the walls. By early 1975, the attic was a sensory nightmare. The air was so saturated with the smell of pine and decay that it felt heavy to breathe. Fritz lived in the middle of it, seemingly unaffected. He would sit in his chair, surrounded by hundreds of swaying green cardboard trees, drinking his schnapps and listening to the radio. He had successfully turned his home into a tomb, and he was the only living thing inside it. He felt he had mastered the situation. He had outsmarted the neighbors, the police, and even nature itself. But he had forgotten one thing: the old frayed electrical wiring of the tenement building. On July 17, 1975, Fritz was at the Golden Glove nursing his second drink of the evening. Back at the apartment, a spark ignited in a cluttered corner of the attic. Because the room was filled with dry cardboard air fresheners and wood scraps, the fire spread rapidly. A neighbor saw smoke billowing from the attic window and called the fire department. When the crews arrived, they had to kick in Fritz's door. They were immediately hit by the wall of heat and the overwhelming, nauseating scent of pine. They moved through the flames trying to find the source of the fire when one of the firemen noticed a strange bulge in the wall. As the fire was brought under control, the lead investigator noticed that the heat had caused the plaster to crack in several places. Through those cracks, he didn't see insulation or wooden studs, he saw plastic. He took his axe and peeled away a large section of the wall. What tumbled out onto the floor was a collection of wrapped bundles heavily crusted in salt. When they opened the first one, the room went silent. It was the torso of a woman. They moved to the next section of the wall, and then the next. Behind the fake forest of air fresheners, the firefighters discovered that the walls of the room were literally lined with the dead. The police were called immediately. They found 4 women in total, all meticulously preserved in the attic voids. They found a collection of saws, bags of salt, and a ledger that Fritz had kept. While they were still processing the scene, the door to the apartment opened. Fritz Honka walked in, still smelling of schnapps and the stale air of the bar. He looked at the police, he looked at the holes in his walls, and he didn't run. He simply sighed, put his hands in his pockets, and asked if he could have one last cigarette before they took him away. The angel of St. Pauli had finally lost his sanctuary. Fritz Honka would eventually be convicted of the murders and sentenced to life in a psychiatric hospital. He died in 1998, but his story remains one of the most chilling chapters in German history. It wasn't just the violence that haunted the investigators, it was the domesticity of it. He had integrated his crimes into the very structure of his home, living among his victims for 5 years while hanging little green trees to pretend everything was normal. The tenement building was eventually renovated, but locals say that on hot July nights, the smell of pine still lingers in the hallways of the 3rd floor. Across the border in Sweden, the fear of the unknown was taking a much more visible and much more colorful form as a community realized their brand new homes were hiding a secret of their own. At 7 o'clock on a crisp morning in March of 1974, in the quiet town of Älmhult, Sweden, a 28-year-old mother named Birgitta was standing in her brand new kitchen. To her, this house was more than just a building. It felt like a miracle. It was part of a massive new development of pristine, ultra-modern homes designed to be the peak of Scandinavian living. Everything inside was sleek and functional, smelling of freshly cut pine and expensive white paint. Birgitta poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the silent street. For years, she and her husband had lived in a cramped, dark apartment in the city, but here, everything was bright and open. She loved the mathematical order of the suburb. There was a sense of profound safety in these sharp, clean lines, and the state-of-the-art appliances that hummed quietly in the background. It was exactly the life she had dreamed of for her family. She walked down the hallway to wake her 5-year-old daughter, Elin. As the morning sun began to filter through the curtains, Birgitta started to brush Elin's fine white blonde hair. As the brush moved through the strands, Birgitta paused. In the specific angle of the sunlight, the hair seemed to have a strange metallic shimmer to it. It wasn't quite blonde anymore. It looked almost like it had been dipped in a very faint iridescent wash of blue or perhaps a pale watery gray. Birgitta blinked and shook her head, assuming her eyes were just playing tricks on her in the early morning shadows. She figured it was just the reflection of the blue curtains or maybe a new type of shampoo she had recently purchased. She finished braiding Elin's hair and sent her off to play. The detail was so small and so seemingly insignificant that Birgitta put it out of her mind entirely as she went about her morning chores and began the process of cleaning the house. By noon, the house was silent as the children played in the backyard. Birgitta decided to take a quick shower before starting lunch. As she stepped into the bathroom, the overhead heat lamp clicked on, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the vanity. She caught her reflection in the mirror and froze. Her own hair, which was normally a bright honey blonde, looked different. She leaned in closer, her heart beginning to drum a steady, nervous rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't a trick of the light this time. Her hair wasn't just shimmering, it had changed color. At the roots and running down through the mid-lengths, her blonde strands had taken on a vivid, unmistakable shade of emerald green. It was a metallic, unnatural color like the patina on an old copper statue. She reached up with trembling fingers to touch it, expecting it to be some kind of dust or powder that would just flake off, but her fingers came away clean. The color was inside the hair. She immediately jumped into the shower and began scrubbing her scalp with a ferocity that left her skin red and raw. She used half a bottle of shampoo, then tried dish soap, and even a bit of lemon juice she found in the kitchen, but nothing worked. If anything, the steam from the hot water seemed to make the green glow even more intensely. She stood in the middle of her beautiful modern bathroom, her chest heaving as she stared at the vibrant green mane reflecting in the glass. Just as she was beginning to spiral into a panic, the phone on the kitchen wall began to ring. It was her neighbor, Karin, who lived 3 houses down in an identical modern home. Karin's voice was high and tight, bordering on hysterical. She asked Birgitta if she had noticed anything strange about the water lately. Birgitta felt a cold chill wash over her skin despite the warmth of the house. She asked Karin what she meant, and Corinne let out a sob. She said her son's hair had turned green. Birgitta walked to her front door and looked out at the neighborhood. It was a picturesque afternoon, but as she looked closely at the other mothers gathering at the local playground, she saw it. Several women and children were walking around with hair that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Some had faint tints, while others, particularly those with the lightest blonde hair, had heads of hair that were a deep, glowing teal. The pristine suburb was beginning to look like a nightmare. Within 48 hours, the green hair enigma had become the only thing anyone in Elmhult could talk about. But as the week progressed, the mystery shifted from a bizarre cosmetic anomaly into something much more frightening. Birgitta woke up on Thursday morning with a dull, throbbing ache in her abdomen. By noon, the pain had sharpened into agonizing cramps that left her doubled over on the kitchen floor. When she went to check on Elin, she found the little girl crying in bed. Ellen complained that her skin felt like it was being bitten by thousands of tiny ants. Birgitta pulled back the girl's pajama top and gasped. Elin's chest and back were covered in a raised, angry red rash that felt hot to the touch. It wasn't just the hair anymore. Something was attacking their bodies from the inside out. Birgitta's own stomach felt like it was filled with hot coals, and a strange metallic taste began to coat her tongue, making every glass of water taste like pennies. The local doctor's office was soon overrun with families from the new development. Everyone had the same story: green hair followed by severe gastrointestinal distress and skin irritation. Panic began to settle over the town like a thick fog. People stopped bathing. They stopped drinking from the taps. They began to eye the modern perfect infrastructure of their new lives with a deep sense of betrayal. They feared they were living on top of an old chemical dump or a hidden industrial site. Public health investigators and chemical engineers from Stockholm arrived in the second week. They were baffled. They tested the air, the soil, and the building materials, but everything came back within normal limits. They checked the local industrial plants, but there were no leaks. One evening, a young engineer named Anders was sitting in Birgitta's kitchen, staring at a glass of her tap water. To the naked eye, the water was crystal clear. It looked as pure as a mountain spring. Anders took a sip and immediately made a face, noting the heavy metallic afterglow. He asked Birgitta to show him the water heater. They went down into the utility room, a space Birgitta usually ignored. Anders began to examine the pipes. He noticed that in these new houses, the builders had used a specific type of unlined copper piping that was popular for its durability. He also knew that the town's water supply came from a newly tapped deep rock well that was famous for its purity. He took a sample of the water directly from the well and ran a series of tests in a portable lab he had set up in his van. When the results came back, he finally found the crack in the world. The well water was incredibly pure, but it was also highly acidic, far more acidic than anyone had realized. When that acidic water sat in the brand new copper pipes of the houses overnight, it began to eat the metal. It was a slow, invisible chemical reaction that was dissolving the copper into the water. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when he looked at the water heaters. The modern high-efficiency heaters in the development were designed to keep water at a very high temperature. This heat was acting as a catalyst, speeding up the chemical reaction until the water coming out of the shower heads was essentially a concentrated solution of copper sulfate. Copper sulfate is a powerful blue-green dye. For the blonde residents of the town, their hair was acting like a sponge for the metal. The medical symptoms were the result of mild copper poisoning. Because the residents were drinking the water and bathing in it every day, the metal was building up in their systems, irritating their stomachs and causing their skin to react to the chemical bath. It wasn't a curse, and it wasn't a secret industrial conspiracy. It was a fluke of chemistry, a perfect accidental alignment between the natural acidity of the earth and the modern materials used to build their perfect lives. The solution was simple but expensive. The town had to install massive lime filters at the well to neutralize the acidity of the water before it ever reached the copper pipes. Slowly, over the course of several months, the green tint began to fade from Birgitta's hair as it grew out. The stomach pains vanished and the rashes cleared up. The town returned to its quiet, orderly routine, but the sense of total safety that Brigida had felt when she first moved in never quite came back. She would still find herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror every morning, checking the roots of her hair for even a hint of green. She had learned that even in a world of clean lines and modern progress, there are invisible forces in the environment that can reach out and change you in ways you never expected. The town of Elmhult became a footnote in medical journals, a warning to architects and engineers about the hidden dangers of mixing pure nature with modern technology. But as one community learned to trust their environment, again, thousands of miles away, a group of businessmen was about to learn that the most dangerous element in any environment isn't a chemical reaction, but the silent, heavy weight of pure gold sitting in the dark. At 5 o'clock in the evening on a humid Wednesday in late December of 1971, a 55-year-old gold merchant named No Chang Po stood in his quiet, air-conditioned home office in Singapore. He was staring down at a heavy black leather briefcase resting on his teak desk. To a stranger, it looked like a standard piece of business luggage, but for No, this bag was the culmination of a decade of hard work and a perfect reputation. Inside, packed in tight, shimmering rows, were 120 solid gold bars. The weight of the briefcase was substantial, nearly 30 pounds, and No had to use both hands to ensure the double latches were securely clicked into place. He wasn't particularly nervous about the value he was carrying because in the early 70s, Singapore felt like a small, tight-knit community where a man's word was his bond. In the traditional gold trade, million-dollar deals were often settled with a simple handshake and a cup of tea. No believed in that old-world trust, and today that trust was being placed in a longtime associate named Andrew Cho. Joining No for this routine transaction were his two most loyal employees. One was a soft-spoken clerk who had handled No's books for years, and the other was a sturdy, reliable driver who acted as a shadow whenever large sums of currency were moved. They were more than just staff, they were the gears that kept No's life running smoothly. As they loaded into the merchant's luxury sedan, the tropical sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The city felt peaceful, bustling with the sounds of evening markets and bicycle bells. The drive to Andrew Cho's estate was short, taking them through a series of winding, tree-lined streets where the houses were hidden behind high stone walls and lush bougainvillea. Andrew was a man of high standing, a respected figure in the aviation industry who lived a life of quiet luxury. He had told No that he had a private buyer lined up who wanted to move a large amount of capital into physical gold before the new year. It was a lucrative deal for everyone involved, and as No's car pulled into the gravel driveway, he felt nothing but a sense of professional satisfaction. As the three men stepped out of the car, they were greeted by the thick, sweet scent of jasmine and the distant hum of a lawnmower. The estate felt like an oasis of calm. Andrew Chu met them at the front door with a wide, welcoming smile, ushering them into a spacious living room cooled by a large rhythmic ceiling fan. He seemed relaxed, dressed in a casual silk shirt, and he immediately apologized for the heat, insisting that they sit down and refresh themselves before getting into the heavy lifting of the gold transfer. No placed the briefcase on a low coffee table between them. He noticed that Andrew had already prepared a tray of tea, which was sitting on a silver service nearby. This was the ritual of the trade. You didn't just talk about money, you built a relationship. Andrew poured 3 cups for his guests, his hands steady and his conversation light touching on the recent developments at the airport and the growth of the city. No took a long sip of the warm, fragrant liquid, feeling the tension of the workday finally begin to bleed out of his shoulders. For about 10 minutes, the conversation flowed easily. But then, No noticed something strange. The steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the room seemed to be getting louder, echoing in his ears like a hammer against an anvil. He tried to adjust his position on the sofa, but his legs felt unusually heavy, as if they were made of cooling lead. He looked over at his clerk, wanting to ask if the room felt a bit stuffy, but he saw that the younger man was already slumped back against the cushions, his eyes glazed and unfocused. A sudden, sharp spike of unease pierced through No's growing lethargy. He tried to reach for the briefcase, but his fingers were numb, refusing to grip the leather handle. The room began to swim in his vision, the white walls blurring into the dark wood of the furniture. He looked up at Andrew Chu, expecting to see a look of concern or a rush for help. Instead, he saw that Andrew's smile had vanished. His associate was simply sitting there, perfectly still, watching them with a cold, analytical detachment that made No's blood run cold. In that moment, the peaceful atmosphere of the luxury estate shattered. From the shadows of the hallway, two men emerged. They weren't servants or family members. They were younger, athletic men wearing dark utilitarian clothing. One of them was carrying a length of thick industrial cord, and the other was pulling on a pair of heavy rubber gloves. No tried to cry out to warn his driver, who was sitting in the chair nearby, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. He could only watch in a drug-induced paralysis as the predators closed the distance. The betrayal was total. Andrew Chu had not just planned a robbery, he had orchestrated a cold-blooded liquidation. He had hired two Air Force technicians, men who understood precision and discipline, to help him carry out a military-style execution. As the darkness finally began to claim No's consciousness, the last thing he saw was the shimmer of his gold bars as the briefcase was popped open. He realized then that the trust he had built his life upon was nothing more than a ghost, and the man he called a friend was a monster who had been waiting for the right price to strike. The disappearance of a prominent gold merchant and his two staff members sent a shockwave through the island nation within 48 hours. No Chengpo was a creature of habit, a man who never missed a dinner with his family and whose books were always balanced to the penny. When his car was found abandoned on a quiet side road, completely wiped of fingerprints but sitting suspiciously low on its suspension, the local police knew they weren't dealing with a simple runaway case. They were looking at a professional kidnapping or something much worse. The investigation initially hit a wall of silence. In the gold trade, many deals were off the books, and No's family didn't know the specifics of his final appointment. However, the lead detective on the case was a man who believed in the weight of things. He noticed that the abandoned car had fresh red clay caked into the wheel wells, a type of soil that was rare in the urban center, but common in the rural, undeveloped northern fringes of the island. He also noted that the car's rear springs were compressed as if it had recently carried a very heavy localized load. While the forensic teams worked on the vehicle, another group of investigators began a meticulous sweep of recent financial transactions. They discovered that Andrew Chu, a man who should have been comfortably wealthy, had actually been drowning in secret gambling debts. He had been shuffling money between accounts for months trying to stay ahead of creditors. When the detectives learned that Cho had been a frequent associate of No Chengpo, they decided to pay him a visit. They arrived at the estate expecting to find a grieving friend, but instead, they found a man who was a little too calm. Andrew Chu greeted the detectives in the same living room where No had taken his last sip of tea. He offered them refreshments and expressed his deep shock over the merchant's disappearance, but he made one small fatal mistake. He mentioned that he hadn't seen Ngo in over 2 weeks. The lead detective looked down at the coffee table and saw a faint circular ring on the wood, a watermark from a tea service that hadn't been polished away. He also noticed that the heavy grandfather clock in the corner had stopped its pendulum frozen at exactly 5:45. The police didn't have enough to arrest him yet, but they began a 24-hour surveillance. They watched as Cho met with 2 men at a local harbor, the Air Force technicians. The trio seemed agitated, whispering in the shadows of a warehouse. When the police moved in to question the technicians, one of them cracked under the pressure. He confessed everything, detailing the drugging, the strangling, and the desperate midnight drive to the Northern District. He told them about the weight of the gold and the weight of the bodies they had to dispose of in a hurry. Following the informant's directions, the police arrived at a desolate, overgrown plot of land near an abandoned mining site. In the center of the clearing sat an old concrete-lined well that had been boarded up for years. As the heavy wooden cover was pried away, a thick, cloying scent of decay and stagnant water rose into the humid air. Divers were called in to descend into the pitch-black depths. At the bottom, resting in the silt and discarded junk, they found the bodies of No Cheng Po and his two loyal employees still dressed in their professional work clothes. The trial of Andrew Chu was one of the most sensational in the history of the young nation. It pulled back the curtain on the dark rot that can hide behind a life of elite privilege. People couldn't wrap their heads around how a man of such high standing could execute 3 innocent people for a pile of metal. But as the details of his debts and his meticulous planning came to light, it became clear that for Chow, the gold wasn't just money. It was a way to maintain the illusion of his life, an illusion he was willing to kill for. In the end, justice was swift. Andrew Shu and his 2 accomplices were sentenced to death, a finality that matched the coldness of their crime. The gold bars were eventually recovered from a hidden floor safe in Shou's home, but they brought no joy back to the families of the victims. The merchant's office remained empty, the teak desk a silent witness to a deal that should have been routine. The case became a permanent warning in the Singaporean consciousness, a reminder that the most dangerous traps aren't set in the shadows, but in the light of a trusted friend's home. As the heavy iron gates of the prison closed on the men who traded lives for gold, the focus of the world shifted across the sea to a different kind of weight. A weight not of precious metal, but of a cargo that was never meant to leave the shore. At 9 o'clock on a freezing Monday night in December of 1970, a 42-year-old citrus farmer named Kim Min was standing on the crowded deck of the Nam Yong Ho ferry. The ship was docked at the Siaguipo port on the southern coast of Jeju Island, and for Kim Min, this was the most important night of his entire year. He had spent the last 8 months tending to his orchards, and now his entire winter harvest was packed into hundreds of wooden crates ready to be sold in the mainland markets. The port was a chaotic symphony of grinding gears, shouting dock workers, and the rhythmic slapping of the tide against the concrete piers. The air was sharp and tasted of salt and diesel, but beneath those heavy industrial scents was the bright, sweet aroma of thousands upon thousands of ripening oranges. To Kim Min, that smell was the scent of security. It meant new school supplies for his children, a new winter coat for his wife, and a much-needed repair for the leaking roof of his farmhouse. He watched as a rusted crane swung yet another massive pallet of crates over the side of the ferry, adding even more weight to an already dangerously crowded vessel. The Nam Yong Ho was a coastal workhorse, a 300-ton steel ferry that had made this journey across the Korea Strait hundreds of times. But tonight, there was something different about the way the ship was behaving. Even as it sat at the dock, it seemed to have a heavy, sluggish quality, as if it were struggling just to stay afloat. Usually when the ship was fully loaded, there was still a significant gap of several feet between the waterline and the lower deck ports. Tonight, however, the black water of the harbor seemed uncomfortably close. The ship was sitting so low that the small waves lapping against the hull were almost reaching the scuppers. Kim Min looked down at the dark, oily surface of the sea and felt a flicker of unease, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the winter wind. It felt like the ship was being held down by an invisible hand. He looked around the deck and saw that every available square inch was occupied. Crates were stacked 10 feet high in some places, blocking the narrow walkways and completely obscuring the view of the lifeboats and emergency rafts. He saw a crew member walking by, checking some of the rope lashings, and Kim Min politely asked if the ship was perhaps a bit over its limit for the night. The sailor didn't even look him in the eye. He just grunted a dismissive reply about the winter rush and moved on to the next stack. Kim Min tried to reassure himself. These men were the professionals, he thought. They knew their ship better than a simple farmer from the hills. He told himself that the ocean was a big place and the Nam Yong Ho was a strong vessel. He took one last look at his crates, reaching out to touch the rough, splintered wood of the top box, and then he made his way down the narrow stairs to the third-class passenger cabin. He needed to rest because tomorrow morning in Busan would be a flurry of negotiations and heavy lifting. The third-class cabin was a large open space packed with other farmers and merchants all huddled together on the floor for warmth. The atmosphere was surprisingly celebratory, filled with the low hum of conversation and the comforting sound of tea being poured from metal thermoses. These were his people, hardworking, exhausted, and filled with a quiet hope for a successful winter season. He found a small spot on the floor near a bulkhead, leaned his back against the vibrating steel, and pulled his coat tight around his shoulders. As the engines roared to life and the ferry began to pull away from the dock, Kim Min felt the familiar vibration through the floor. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the motion of the ship felt wrong. Instead of the gentle, rhythmic pitching he was used to, the ferry felt stiff and heavy. It didn't ride over the waves, it seemed to plow through them, the steel hull groaning under the pressure of the water. He could hear the waves slamming into the side of the ship with a sound like a muffled sledgehammer. About an hour after they cleared the shelter of the Jeju coastline, the ferry entered the true strength of the open sea. The motion of the ship changed dramatically, shifting into a sharp, jarring roll that sent several loose teacups sliding across the floor. Kim Min was jolted awake when a heavy brass kettle slammed into his boot. He sat up and noticed that the floor was no longer level. It wasn't just the waves. The ship seemed to be leaning to the left, and it was taking a very long time to return to its upright position. He stood up, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm that he could feel in his throat. He noticed that the conversation in the cabin had suddenly died down. Everyone was looking at the walls, watching the way the shadows moved. From deep within the belly of the ship, Kim Min heard a sound that made his stomach turn. It was a low, muffled groan of wood against wood, followed by a sudden, sharp crack that echoed through the steel frame. It sounded like a massive tree limb snapping in the middle of a storm. He decided he couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. He needed to see what was happening. He climbed the stairs back to the upper deck, but as he pushed open the heavy steel door, the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The sea was an angry, churning mess of white foam and black ink, and the ferry was rolling dangerously with every wave. He looked toward the cargo area and felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. In the dim light, he could see that the stacks of crates were swaying like drunk men, their ropes straining. He realized then that the crew had been forced to stack crates on top of the hatch covers to make room for more cargo. This meant the center of gravity for the ship was now far higher than it should have been. Every time the ship tilted the weight of the oranges, wanted to keep it going further. He watched as a particularly large wave hammered into the starboard side, and the ferry leaned so far to the port that the railing actually dipped into the water. For a terrifying second, the ship stayed there, suspended over the abyss. Then came the sound that would haunt Kim Min for the rest of his life. It wasn't a snap this time, it was a roar. Thousands of pounds of wooden crates filled with the weight of an entire island's harvest gave way at once. The sound of splintering wood and sliding glass was deafening as the cargo shifted with the force of an avalanche. The unsecured weight rushed toward the port side of the vessel all at once, and the Nam Young Ho didn't just tilt, it began to capsize. The floor beneath Kim Min's feet simply vanished. He managed to grab a railing, his fingers numbing instantly as he hung suspended over the black freezing water. He looked back toward the cabin door and saw people screaming, trying to scramble up the inclined deck toward the exits, but the ship was moving too fast. The weight of the cargo had turned the ferry into a steel trap. Within 60 seconds, the lower deck windows were completely underwater. He could hear the muffled sound of glass breaking and the terrifying roar of the ocean rushing into the living spaces of the ship. The cold was the next thing he felt. It hit his legs, then his waist, and it was so intense it felt like he was being burned with liquid nitrogen. He managed to pull himself onto the side of the hull as the ship turned completely over its keel, pointing toward the stars like the belly of a dead whale. He was one of the few who had been on the deck and was able to stay above the surface, but as he looked around, the horror of the situation truly began to set in. He was in the middle of the Korea Strait in the dead of winter. He searched the dark water for a lifeboat or an emergency raft, but he saw nothing but debris. He realized then that the lifeboats had been blocked by the cargo and the crew had been unable to launch them as the ship went down. Around him, the voices of his friends and neighbors were calling out from the darkness, their cries being silenced one by the freezing spray and the exhaustion of the struggle. He found himself alone on the smooth, cold steel of the hull, with the freezing wind whipping against his wet clothes. He saw a wooden crate floating nearby, one of his own orange crates that had somehow stayed intact during the slide. He knew he couldn't stay on the hull as it was slowly settling deeper into the water. He took a breath, gritted his teeth, and slid back into the freezing water, swimming with every ounce of strength he had left. He managed to pull his upper body onto the wooden box, his chest heaving as he tried to keep his head above the waves. He was floating in a graveyard of citrus, surrounded by the smell of his own harvest. For hours, Kim Min drifted in the darkness, his body slowly beginning to shut down from the extreme hypothermia. He watched as the bright round oranges from his own orchard bobbed on the surface of the water around him, illuminated by the cold, indifferent moonlight. They were the only things left of his hard work and his dreams for his family. He felt a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over him, the kind of quiet lethargy that comes when the brain finally gives up the fight and prepares for the end of the line. He was eventually pulled from the water just before dawn by a small fishing boat that had happened upon the debris field by pure chance. The fishermen were horrified by what they found, a sea covered in oranges and only a handful of people still clinging to life. Kim Min was one of only 12 survivors. 326 people, including his friends from the cabin and the families he had chatted with on the dock, had vanished into the Korea Strait in less than 5 minutes. They were gone, as if they had never existed. In the weeks that followed, the true scale of the betrayal came to light during the official inquiry. Investigators discovered that the Namyoung Ho was carrying 4 times its legal cargo weight. To maximize profit, the owners had intentionally bypassed every safety check. They had hidden the overloading from port officials by loading the ship in the dark, and they had neglected to perform any maintenance on the emergency equipment. But the most damning detail was yet to come, something that would turn the tragedy into a national scandal. It was revealed that the ship's captain and the company directors had ordered the crew to disable the radio and the radar systems to avoid paying certain transit and inspection fees. This meant that when the ship went down, there was no way to send an emergency signal. The Namyoung Ho had simply disappeared into the night, and no one on the mainland even knew it was missing until hours after the last victim had succumbed to the cold. The lives of 300 people had been traded for a few dollars of savings on a monthly balance sheet. The disaster remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of South Korea, a tragedy that was entirely preventable and born of pure, unadulterated greed. It forced a total rewrite of maritime safety laws and a purge of the port authorities, but for the families of Jeju Island, the cost was far too high. The island's citrus industry was decimated not because of the loss of the oranges, but because of the loss of the fathers and sons who were the heart of the community. A generation of knowledge and labor had been wiped out in a single night. For Kim Min, the physical scars of the cold eventually healed, but the mental ones remained as fresh as a new cut. He never returned to the orchards, and he could never again bear the smell of an orange. To him, that bright, sweet scent was no longer a symbol of security or a bright future. It was a sensory trigger that brought him back to that freezing night in the middle of the ocean, hanging onto a wooden box, while the world he knew sank into the black water beneath him. He spent the rest of his life in a quiet house far from the sea. The final haunting image that stayed with the nation for decades wasn't the image of the sunken ship itself, but the sight of the miles of shoreline along the southern coast of Korea. For weeks after the sinking, millions of bright, sweet oranges washed up on the beaches, covering the sand in a carpet of gold. They were perfectly preserved by the cold water, serving as a silent, vibrant memorial to the 326 people who had been bartered away for cargo space and were now resting at the bottom of the strait. As the orange-scented tragedy of the Korea Strait began to settle into the collective memory of the East, thousands of miles to the west, a different kind of golden glow was casting a long shadow over the streets of Buenos Aires, where a young man with the face of an angel was proving that the most beautiful things in the world can hide the most horrific secrets. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on a warm Tuesday in March of 1971, a 62-year-old night watchman named Manuel was sitting in his small glass-walled office at a high-end car dealership in Buenos Aires. The city around him was hushed, the usual roar of traffic replaced by the distant, rhythmic hum of a street sweeper and the occasional bark of a stray dog echoing off the stone buildings. For Manuel, this was the quietest hour of his shift. He poured a small amount of strong black coffee from a stained thermos and listened to the low crackle of his transistor radio. The dealership was filled with the gleaming chrome and polished steel of the latest European imports, their curves catching the faint light from the street lamps outside. Manuel had worked here for over 5 years, and he knew every shadow and every creak of the floorboards. It was a safe, predictable world defined by the smell of floor wax and motor oil. Manuel was adjusting the dial on his radio when he heard a light rhythmic tapping on the glass door of the showroom. It was so faint that he initially thought it was just a loose branch or a large insect drawn to the light. He stood up his joints, protesting with a dull ache, and walked toward the entrance. Through the thick glass, he saw someone standing there. It wasn't a prowler or a desperate drifter. It was a young man, barely more than a boy, with very soft features. The boy had a mass of golden curls that caught the light like a halo and wide, innocent eyes that seemed to glow with a gentle curiosity. He looked like he had stepped out of a Renaissance painting or off the set of a teenage movie. He was dressed neatly, and he didn't look threatened or threatening. He looked lost. Manuel felt an immediate paternal surge of concern. He assumed the boy's car had broken down or that he had been separated from his friends in the big city. Manuel reached for the heavy iron key at his belt, his fingers moving with a slow, practiced ease. He didn't feel any of the usual signals of danger, no racing heart, no cold sweat on the back of his neck. In his mind, this boy was the very definition of harmless. He smiled through the glass and began to turn the lock, intending to invite the young man inside for a cup of coffee while they waited for help. He never noticed the way the boy's hands were tucked deeply into his pockets. The moment the lock clicked, the atmosphere in the showroom changed. It was as if the temperature had suddenly dropped 20 degrees. The boy didn't say a word. He didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer a name. He simply stepped inside and pulled a .32 caliber handgun from his jacket. Before Manuel could even process the sight of the weapon, the boy raised it and fired once. The night watchman fell back into the polished bumper of a luxury sedan, the sound of the gunshot echoing. As Manuel lay on the cold floor, his vision beginning to blur at the edges, he watched the boy move through the showroom. The teenager didn't look nervous or frantic. He didn't rush to grab the cash box or look for car keys. Instead, he walked slowly, almost gracefully, running his hand along the fenders of the cars as if he were shopping for a gift. He looked perfectly at peace. It was a sight that made the dying man's heart skip a beat, the pure, calm indifference of a monster. Over the next 12 months, the city of Buenos Aires was gripped by a wave of terror that felt unlike anything the police had ever seen. It wasn't just the robberies, it was the sheer casual brutality of the crimes. Security guards, night watchmen, and business owners were being executed in cold blood. The victims were often found shot in the back or while they were sleeping in their offices. There was never any sign of a struggle, and very little physical evidence was ever left behind. The detectives assigned to the task force were working under immense pressure. They spent their nights scouring the gritty underworld of the city, interviewing career criminals and known hitmen. They were looking for a scarred, hardened professional, someone with a history of violence and a desperate need for money. They built profiles of a man who was probably middle-aged, perhaps a veteran of the military, and certainly someone who looked like a killer. They never looked at the kids. In reality, the person they were looking for was 19-year-old Carlos Robledo Puig. He lived in a comfortable, middle-class neighborhood with his respectable parents. To his neighbors, he was the golden boy, a quiet and well-mannered teenager who was always ready to help with a heavy bag of groceries. He was a talented pianist and a decent student. His parents were proud of him, never suspecting that their son was spending his nights hunting human beings for pure adrenaline. Carlos didn't have a motive that the police could understand. He didn't come from poverty, and he wasn't part of a gang. He committed these atrocities because he felt a profound sense of boredom that only the sound of a gunshot could cure. He eventually teamed up with a classmate named Jorge Sommers, who was just as nihilistic as he was. Together, they transformed the city into their private playground, moving from one commercial target to the next with a terrifying efficiency. Imagine you are a detective in Buenos Aires in late 1971. You are standing in the middle of a ransacked hardware store, looking down at yet another body. You feel a deep sense of frustration because the killer seems to be a ghost. There are no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no pattern other than the coldness of the act. You find yourself wondering if you are looking for a human being at all, or if there is something truly demonic moving through the shadows of the city. The crack in Carlos's perfect world finally appeared on a rainy night in February of 1972. He and Jorge had broken into a large hardware store on the outskirts of the city. They had spent hours looting the safe and gathering expensive tools, but as they were preparing to leave, a disagreement broke out. Jorge was becoming increasingly nervous about the frequency of their crimes and the growing heat from the police. He wanted to slow down, to go into hiding for a few months. Carlos didn't like being told what to do. In his mind, Jorge was no longer an accomplice. He was a loose end. While Jorge was busy securing a heavy bag of stolen goods, Carlos stepped behind him and fired a single shot into the back of his head. But Carlos knew that a body in a hardware store would eventually be identified, and that would lead the police directly back to his own front door. He needed to ensure that his friend's face could never be recognized by the authorities. He found a blowtorch in the back of the shop and spent the next hour systematically burning Jorge's face and fingertips. It was a gruesome mechanical task that Carlos performed with the same calm focus he used when practicing the piano. He was so confident in his plan that he didn't even bother to check his partner's pockets before he left. He simply stepped out into the rain, feeling a sense of relief that he was once again working alone. He drove home and went to sleep like a baby. The next morning, the police arrived at the store. At first, they thought they had found another one of the mysterious killer's victims. But as they processed the scene, they realized the burned man was actually part of the crew. When the coroner rolled the body over, a small laminated card fell out of the pocket of the man's jacket. It was a national identity card belonging to Carlos Robledo Puig. It seemed that in his rush to leave, Carlos had accidentally dropped his own ID next to the body. The arrest of Carlos was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance for the entire nation. When the police pulled up to the quiet tree-lined street and escorted the golden-haired teenager out of his house in handcuffs, the neighbors stood on their porches in total silence. They couldn't reconcile the angel they knew with the monster the police were describing. Even the hardened detectives felt a shiver of unease when they finally sat across from him in the interrogation room. Carlos didn't deny any of it. He sat in the metal chair, his golden curls falling over his eyes, and recounted his 11 murders with a terrifying level of detail. He spoke about the night watchmen and the sleeping guards as if he were describing a series of boring errands. He showed no remorse, no fear, and no anger. He was a hollow vessel, a beautiful shell that contained nothing but a cold, dark void. He even asked the detectives if he could play the piano in the station lobby. The trial of Carlos Robledo Puig became a cultural landmark in Argentina. It forced the country to confront the reality that evil doesn't always wear a mask or hide in the slums. Sometimes it has the face of a movie star and a middle-class upbringing. Carlos was eventually sentenced to life in prison, the maximum penalty allowed. He has remained behind bars for over 50 years, becoming the longest-serving prisoner in the history of the country. he still maintains a quiet, eerie calm. His story remains a haunting reminder of the everyday fear that hides in the most beautiful places. He proved that the most dangerous predator isn't the one you see coming from a mile away, it's the one who taps gently on your window in the middle of the night, looking like someone you can trust. He was the Angel of Death, a boy who traded the lives of 11 people for a moment of excitement, leaving behind a trail of blood that the city of Buenos Aires would never fully forget. As the heavy iron doors of the prison closed on the boy with the golden curls, the world turned its attention to the dark, pressurized depths of the Atlantic, where another group of men was about to face a nightmare that no amount of beauty could hide. At 8:43 in the evening on April 8, 1970, Captain Vsevolod Bassanov was standing in the pressurized heart of the Soviet nuclear submarine Kate. They were cruising at a depth of 160 meters beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, and for Bassanov and his crew of 51 men, the environment inside the steel hull felt like a triumph of human engineering. The air was cool and recycled, smelling faintly of ozone and machine oil. It was a safe, predictable world where every dial and switch was a promise of total control. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the twin nuclear reactors, a vibration so constant it had become as natural as a heartbeat to the men on board. Bassanov had spent the better part of his life in these cramped underwater corridors, and he trusted the machine beneath his feet. He felt a sense of profound pride in the silence they maintained as they patrolled the dark depths. As the captain reached for a clipboard to log the evening's final status report, a single tiny red light on the main control board began to flicker. It was so small and so dim that at first Bassanov thought it was just a loose bulb or a trick of the overhead lighting. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the circuit. It was a warning for the third compartment, an area filled with high-voltage electrical runs. He tapped the glass, expecting it to go out. The light didn't go out. Instead, a second light began to glow, and then a third. Within seconds, a low melodic chime echoed through the command center, the sound of an automatic fire suppression system being armed. This was the first sign that the peaceful world of the Kate was beginning to crack. Bassanov felt a sharp spike of unease, a cold sensation in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. He immediately ordered a status check. Before the radio operator could even reach for his headset, the smell hit them. It wasn't the sweet smell of a kitchen fire or the sharp scent of burning paper. It was a thick chemical stench of burning rubber and melting plastic insulation. It was the smell of a machine eating itself from the inside out. Then came the sound, a muffled, heavy thump from behind the heavy steel bulkhead of the third compartment, followed by a sudden, violent vibration that shook the entire hull. Bassanov grabbed the command rail, his knuckles turning white as he fought to stay upright. The lights in the command center flickered and died, replaced by the eerie, spinning red glow of the emergency lamps. He realized that this wasn't just a localized short circuit. It was a catastrophic electrical fire, and it was spreading through the cable runs like a fuse. The fire was moving toward the 8th compartment, where the secondary control systems were located. The captain knew that if the fire reached the reactors, they would lose all power and the ship would become a steel coffin. He barked out a series of orders to blow the ballast tanks and surface the vessel. It was a desperate move that would expose their position to the Western world, but he had no choice. He felt the ship tilt upward, the floor becoming a steep ramp as the massive submarine struggled to claw its way back to the surface and the life-giving air above. As the Kate breached the surface, the men inside were hit by a secondary nightmare. They hadn't surfaced into a calm moonlit sea. They had emerged directly into a massive autumn storm in the Bay of Biscay. 40-foot waves were hammering the hull with the force of falling buildings, and the freezing wind was screaming through the open bridge hatch. The submarine designed for the quiet depths was now being tossed around like a hollow tin can on a mountain of water. Bassanov climbed up to the bridge, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the freezing spray hit his face. The scene was chaotic. Thick, toxic smoke was pouring out of the ventilation shafts, curling into the dark sky. Half of his crew was trapped in the forward compartments, while the other half was huddled in the stern. The electrical fire had severed the internal communication lines, leaving the ship divided and blind. The only thing keeping them afloat was the buoyancy of the tanks. He looked out at the churning black ocean and realized the magnitude of the dilemma he was facing. The nuclear reactors were still online, but without power to the cooling pumps, they were beginning to overheat. If they reached a critical temperature, the cores would melt and a massive radiological disaster would follow. He had to send men back into the smoke-filled hull to manually shut down the reactors. It was a mission that offered almost no chance of return for those who went. Imagine if you were one of those young sailors standing on a rocking wet deck in the middle of a hurricane, being asked to crawl back into a dark, toxic tunnel of fire to save a world that didn't even know you existed. You would feel the cold sweat on your palms despite the freezing wind, and your throat would be so dry you could barely swallow. But Bessonov didn't have to ask twice. The men of the Kate were professional sailors, and they understood the stakes. A group of volunteers, led by the chief engineer, pulled on their heavy respirators and disappeared back into the hatch. For the next several hours, Bessonov waited in the storm, his heart hammering against his ribs with every wave that buried the bridge. He could hear the muffled sounds of shouting and the rhythmic clanging of wrenches from deep below. Then the humming of the ship finally died. The reactors had been successfully neutralized. They were now safe from a meltdown. However, the cost of that safety was total. The Kate was now a dead ship drifting without power or heat in the middle of an Atlantic gale. The toxic smoke had filled the living quarters, forcing the remaining crew to stay on the exposed, slippery deck. For 4 days, they battled the elements. They tied themselves to the railings with whatever rope they could find, their bodies becoming numb from the constant spray and the lack of sleep. They were waiting for a rescue. But the rescue was being held back by a force more powerful than the storm, the Cold War. The Soviet government had forbidden Bessonov from sending out an international distress signal. They didn't want the Western navies to see their top secret nuclear technology, even if it meant leaving their own men to die in the Bay of Biscay. For 96 hours, Western merchant ships passed within a few miles of the dying submarine, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the dark. By the fourth night, the Kate was sitting dangerously low in the water. The fire had weakened the structural integrity of the hull, and the constant pounding of the waves was starting to open up the seams. Bessonov stood on the deck, his face a mask of exhaustion and grief. He looked at his men, their eyes sunken and their skin gray from the cold, and he knew they couldn't hold on much longer. He began the process of transferring the survivors to a small rescue tug. Just as the last group was preparing to leave, a massive rogue wave hit the port side of the sub. It wasn't just a wave, it was a wall of water that seemed to reach the clouds. There was a sound like a gunshot, followed by the terrifying roar of steel tearing. The Kate snapped. The hull that had been Bessonov's home for years simply gave up. The ship began to slide backward into the abyss, dragging the final 52 men, including the captain, down with it. They didn't go down as victims of an accident. They went down as martyrs for a secret. The Kate disappeared into the 4,000-meter depths of the Atlantic in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but a few patches of oil and a collection of empty life jackets bobbing in the foam. The Soviet government kept the disaster a secret for decades, and the families of the 52 men were told only that their loved ones had died during a routine training exercise. The truth only began to emerge after the fall of the Soviet Union, revealing the incredible human sacrifice that had occurred in the dark of the Bay of Biscay. The men of the Kate had saved the Atlantic from a nuclear catastrophe, but they had been abandoned by the very system they were sworn to protect. Their story remains a haunting reminder of the hidden costs of global power, where the lives of individuals are often used as currency in a game they never asked to play. The final haunting image that stays with you is the thought of those 52 men sitting in the silence of the deep, their ship resting on the ocean floor, perfectly preserved by the cold and the pressure. They are still there, a silent radioactive monument to a war that was fought in the shadows. As the Atlantic waves finally smoothed over the site of the sinking thousands of miles away, a different kind of silence was settling over a drainage ditch in Taiwan. At 6 o'clock on a gray, humid morning in 1974, in the industrial suburb of Sanchong, Taiwan, a 58-year-old rice farmer named Chen was beginning his daily routine. Sanchong was a place that never truly slept, a landscape of concrete factories and narrow alleys that hummed with the sound of thousands of textile looms. For Chen, the noise was just the background music to his work. He was walking along a narrow concrete drainage ditch that separated his small plot of land from a towering garment factory. The water in the ditch was usually a murky gray filled with industrial runoff and the debris of a city in a hurry. It was his job to keep the flow clear so his fields wouldn't flood during the sudden tropical downpours. He carried a long bamboo pole, using it to push aside trash and plastic bags. As he reached a bend in the canal where the water slowed down, he spotted something caught on a rusted iron pipe. It was a large, heavy-looking plastic sack tied tightly at the top. At first, Chen didn't think much of it. In this part of the city, factories often dumped their scraps directly into the water to save on disposal costs. He assumed it was just another bundle of rejected fabric or leather offcuts from one of the nearby shops. He reached out with his bamboo pole and gave the bag a sharp tug to dislodge it, but the bag was much heavier than he expected. It didn't bob or float, it sat low in the water, anchored by its own mysterious weight. As he pulled, he noticed a very specific detail that made him pause. The bag wasn't tied with scrap wire or common twine, it was secured with a very professional industrial-grade green nylon rope. He gave the bag one more forceful pull, and the tension caused the plastic to tear against the jagged edge of the pipe. Chen's heart skipped a beat as he saw something pale and smooth emerge from the tear. It wasn't fabric. He leaned over the edge of the concrete, his breath hitching in his chest, and realized he was looking at a human shoulder. The smell, which had been masked by the stagnant water, suddenly hit him a thick, iron-like scent of old blood. His hands began to shake so violently that he dropped his bamboo pole into the water. He didn't scream, his throat felt too tight for that. He just turned and ran toward the nearest police outpost, his wooden clogs clattering against the pavement in a desperate, uneven rhythm. He felt a cold sweat breaking out across his back, despite the suffocating heat of the morning. Within the hour, the quiet drainage ditch was tramping, yensuring investigators in heavy rubber boots waded into the murky water to recover the sack. When they brought it to the bank and carefully cut it open, they found the dismembered remains of a young woman. It was a calculated mechanical act of violence. There were no clothes, no jewelry, and no personal items that could give the victim a name. In the 1970s, Sanchong was a transient city, a place where thousands of young women from rural villages arrived every month to work in the textile mills. They were the invisible backbone of the economy, often living in crowded dormitories where a single person's absence might not be noticed for days. For the detectives, this wasn't just a murder, it was a ghost story. The lead detective on the case was a man named Captain Wu. He stood on the muddy bank, his eyes fixed on the green nylon rope that had been used to bind the sack. He picked up a discarded length of the cord and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. It was high-quality material, the kind used in heavy-duty industrial sewing machines or for bundling large shipments of export goods. It wasn't the kind of thing someone would buy at a local hardware store. He looked at the victim and felt a deep sense of frustration. Without an identity, he had no starting point. He had no motive, no suspects, and no scene of the crime. He realized that the killer had exploited the very nature of Sanchong, the anonymity of the industrial machine, to make this woman disappear before she was even dead. Captain Wu returned to the station and ordered a massive sweep of the local missing persons reports. But as the days turned into a week, the results were discouraging. There were dozens of reports of young women who had walked away from their factory jobs or failed to return to their villages, but none of the descriptions seemed to match the physical details of the woman in the ditch. The detectives were working in a vacuum, their only evidence being a bag, a length of rope, and a body that no one seemed to miss. Wu found himself staring at the forensic photos late into the night, his office smelling of stale cigarettes and old paper. He felt like he was looking at a puzzle where all the pieces had been sanded down until they no longer fit together. He needed one small solid detail to break the silence. The breakthrough didn't come from a witness or a confession, it came from the medical examiner's final detailed report. During the cleaning of the remains, the doctor had discovered a tiny, partially destroyed tattoo on the victim's inner left arm. It was a small, stylized bird barely an inch wide. Because of the way the body had been treated, the image was distorted, but the ink was a very specific shade of deep indigo. Captain Wu felt a spark of hope. In the conservative society of 1970s, Taiwan tattoos on women were extremely rare and usually indicated a specific social circle or a rebellious history. This wasn't just a mark, it was a signature. He realized that if he could find the artist who drew that bird, he could find the woman's name. While a team of officers began visiting every known tattoo parlor in the northern part of the island, Wu decided to focus on the other half of the mystery, the green nylon rope. He contacted the primary manufacturers of industrial twine in the district and asked for a list of every factory that had purchased that specific gauge and color in the last 6 months. It was a monumental task involving the cross-referencing of hundreds of handwritten ledgers and delivery receipts. He spent days in the dusty backrooms of warehouses, his fingers turning gray from the carbon paper. He was looking for a bridge between the industrial world and the personal life of the victim. He believed that the killer hadn't just used the rope because it was available, they had used it because it was part of their daily life. After 4 days of searching, Wu found a match. A large textile factory just 3 blocks from the drainage ditch had purchased 500 spools of that exact green rope in August. He immediately drove to the facility, a massive windowless building that vibrated with the roar of 1,000 looms. He met with the floor manager and showed him the photo of the small bird tattoo. The manager looked at the picture for a long time, his face tightening. He told Wu that the tattoo looked familiar. He remembered a young woman named Lu Lin Chin who had worked in the packing department. She was a quiet, hardworking girl from a southern village who had suddenly stopped showing up for her shift 10 days ago. Her coworkers assumed she had simply moved to a different factory for better pay. Wu felt a cold, sharp sensation in his chest. He finally had a name, Lu Lin Chin. He went to the dormitory where she had stayed and found her small locker. Inside were a few simple dresses, a pair of worn shoes, and a photo of her family back home. But the most important thing he found was a small hand-drawn map tucked into the back of a notebook. It showed the way to a private apartment in a nearby residential block. According to the other girls in the dormitory, Lu had been seeing a man who worked as a mechanic in one of the neighboring plants. They said she was excited about the relationship, believing it was her ticket out of the factory life. She had been visiting his apartment every evening after her shift ended, often carrying small gifts or food. The detectives moved on the apartment that evening. It was a cramped single-room unit on the 4th floor of a gray concrete building. When they knocked on the door, a 34-year-old man named Lin answered. He looked perfectly ordinary, dressed in a grease-stained undershirt and carrying a bottle of beer. He seemed confused by the presence of the police, but as Captain Wu stepped into the room, he didn't look at Lin's face. He looked at the floor. In the corner of the room, tucked neatly under a workbench, was a spool of green nylon rope. Beside it was a large, heavy-duty industrial stapler and a stack of black plastic sacks identical to the one found in the ditch. The object clue was sitting right there in plain sight, a silent witness to what had happened in that room. The air in the small apartment was thick with the smell of floor wax and something else, a faint, lingering scent of bleach that didn't quite cover the metallic tang of blood. Lin didn't put up a fight. He sat down on his bed and buried his face in his hands as the detectives began to search the room. They found Lu's watch hidden in a drawer and a single blood-stained earring under the radiator. The story that emerged was a classic tale of jealousy and possession. Lin had become obsessed with the idea that Lu was going to leave him for someone else. In a moment of blind rage, he had ended her life, and then using the cold mechanical skills he had learned on the factory floor, he had tried to turn her into just another piece of industrial waste. He had believed that by dismembering her and using the tools of his trade, he could make her vanish into the gray machinery of Sanchang. He thought the green rope and the plastic bags would look like any other bundle of scrap. He hadn't counted on the farmer's diligence, the resilience of a tiny indigo tattoo, or the persistence of a detective who knew how to read the language of the industrial world. As Lin was led away in handcuffs, he looked small and pathetic. A man who had tried to play God with a spool of twine. The everyday fear of the city, the fear of being forgotten and erased, had been realized in the most horrific way possible, but the very machine that was supposed to hide the crime had ultimately exposed it. Lu Linchen was eventually returned to her village in the south, where her family gave her a proper burial. The drainage ditch in Sanchang was eventually filled in and paved over as the city continued to grow and modernize. But for the people who lived through that year, the green nylon rope became a symbol of a hidden darkness that can exist in the middle of a bustling, productive world. It was a reminder that even in a landscape of concrete and steel, the human heart remains the most unpredictable and dangerous element of all. The case changed the way the Taiwanese police handled the disappearances of migrant workers, ensuring that no one else would be allowed to become a ghost in the machine quite so easily. The final haunting image that stays with you is the thought of that small bird tattoo. It was a tiny symbol of freedom and identity, a small mark of rebellion that Lu Linchen had chosen for herself. In the end, it was that one piece of her true self that refused to be erased, reaching out from the murky water of a drainage ditch to ensure that her name would never be forgotten. It was a small indigo light in a very dark place. As the industrial looms of Sanchang continued their rhythmic, indifferent hum, the focus of the world shifted across the mountains to a remote village in India, where a different kind of ritual was being prepared in the shadows of an ancient superstition. At 6 o'clock on a dusty golden evening in March of 1972, a 24-year-old woman named Kamala was walking along a narrow, sun-baked trail outside the village of Manawat in Maharashtra, India. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and the lingering heat of a long afternoon. Kamala was carrying a large bundle of firewood on her head, her movements steady and graceful despite the heavy load. To her, this walk was the most peaceful part of her day. Manawat was a place where time seemed to move at the speed of the changing seasons. It was a quiet rural community where everyone knew each other's business, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the harvest and the village well. Kamala had made this exact walk 1,000 times before. She knew every twisted neem tree and every jagged rock along the path. There was a profound sense of security in the familiarity of the landscape, a feeling that nothing could ever truly go wrong here. As she neared a dense grove of thorn bushes about a mile from the village outskirts, Kamala paused to adjust the weight of the wood. The only sound should have been the rhythmic chirping of the cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle, but as she stood still, she heard something else. It was a low, melodic vibration coming from the shadows of the trees. It sounded like a group of people performing a traditional religious chant, the kind of deep-throated prayer you might hear at a temple. Kamala wasn't afraid. In fact, she felt a sense of curiosity. She assumed a local elder or a traveling holy man was performing a blessing on the land to ensure a good monsoon. She adjusted her sari and stepped off the main trail, moving toward the sound. She figured she might receive a small blessing or perhaps a bit of sacred ash. As she pushed through the dry brush, the chanting grew louder, but the tone of it began to feel different, heavier, and more rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She emerged into a small hidden clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the center of the space, she saw several figures dressed in dark robes gathered around a flickering stone altar. The air in the clearing didn't smell like incense or jasmine. It smelled of hot copper and damp earth. Kamala's heart gave a sudden sharp skip against her ribs. She realized then that this wasn't a village prayer. The eyes of the figures turned toward her, and they didn't look holy. Kamala never returned home that night. Her disappearance was initially treated by the village as a tragic accident or perhaps a run-in with a wild animal. But over the next 24 months, 9 more women from Manawat and the surrounding hamlets vanished into thin air. Each time, they were women who had gone out alone at twilight to collect water or wood. The once peaceful trails became places of terror, and the village elders began to whisper about a forest demon or a curse. The local police were completely out of their depth. They searched the woods and the nearby rivers, but they found no tracks and no evidence. It was as if the earth itself were opening up and swallowing the women whole. The fear became a physical weight in the village, a cold pressure that made people lock their doors at 5 in the evening and refuse to look toward the trees. The everyday fear had arrived, transforming their familiar world into a landscape of invisible traps. The case finally landed on the desk of a specialized state detective named Inspector Ramakant. He was a man who didn't believe in demons or curses. He believed in the cold mechanical logic of human behavior. When he arrived in Manawat, he didn't go into the forest. Instead, he sat in the village square and watched the people. He noticed that while the rest of the community was paralyzed by fear, one household seemed completely unaffected by the growing list of the missing. This was the home of a wealthy and highly educated couple named Rukmini and her husband. They lived in a large, modern house on the edge of the village, surrounded by high walls and lush gardens. Rukmini was a woman of high standing, often seen at social functions, and known for her knowledge of ancient history and local folklore. While other women were terrified to leave their kitchens, Rukmini moved about the village with a calm, almost regal indifference to the danger. Inspector Ramakant began to look into the couple's history and discovered something interesting. Despite their outward appearance of wealth, they were actually struggling with massive hidden debts related to failed land investments. They had been selling off family jewelry and property for months just to keep their estate running. The inspector found it strange that a couple facing financial ruin would seem so relaxed while a serial killer was supposedly stalking their neighborhood. He decided to set up a surveillance post in an old grain silo overlooking the back of their property. For 3 nights, he saw nothing but the movement of the wind in the trees. But on the 4th night, as a sliver of a moon rose over the hills, he saw a group of men entering the back gate of the estate. They were carrying heavy bags and moving with a practiced, stealthy grace. They weren't servants. They were the same dark-robed figures Kamala had seen in the woods. Ramakant watched through his binoculars as the group gathered in a large open courtyard behind the house. Rukmini and her husband emerged from the back door carrying long, flickering torches. The atmosphere on the property was electric, filled with a low, rhythmic chanting that made the hair on the back of the inspector's neck stand up. He realized then that the forest demon wasn't a myth at all. It was a coordinated human operation being directed from the center of power. He moved in with a team of officers just as the ritual was reaching its peak. As they breached the walls, they found a scene that looked like it had been plucked from the Middle Ages. The clearing in the garden was centered around a deep, hand-dug hole in the earth. Scattered around the pit were the remains of the missing women. But it wasn't a graveyard. It was a laboratory of superstition. The victims had been meticulously drained of their blood using clean surgical cuts. Rukmini and her husband were arrested on the spot, along with the cultists they had hired. As the inspector began the interrogation, he expected to find a pair of raving lunatics. Instead, he found 2 people who spoke with a chilling academic detachment. They explained that they had discovered an ancient manuscript detailing a blood sacrifice required to appease a specific deity. This deity, they believed, held the key to a massive mythical treasure buried under their home. They believed that the ground would only give up the gold once it had been fed the life force of 10 innocent women. They weren't killing for pleasure or for anger, they were killing for a return on investment. To them, the lives of the village women were simply raw materials, a type of ritual currency required to unlock a fortune that would save their social status. They had used their wealth and education to weaponize ancient fear against the very people who looked up to them. The discovery sent a shockwave through India. It forced the legal system to confront the fact that even in a rapidly modernizing nation, the dark pole of occult violence remained a potent threat. The couple was eventually sentenced to life in prison and the cultists were executed, but the physical evidence of their madness remained. The inspector ordered the hole in the garden to be fully excavated just to be sure. They dug for 3 days, going down nearly 30 feet into the soil. They found nothing. There was no gold, no ancient chest, and no hidden temple. There was only the damp, dark earth, and the realization that 10 families had been destroyed for a delusion. The Manabat ritual treasure was a ghost, a fantasy fueled by greed and desperation. The house was eventually demolished by the village, the people refusing to let the structure stand. They wanted to erase every physical trace of the couple who had treated their daughters like livestock. The final haunting image that stays with the people of Maharashtra is the sight of that massive empty hole in the middle of a once beautiful garden. It stands as a silent gaping mouth in the earth, a monument to the void left by the 10 women who vanished. The grass has grown back over the edges, but the soil in the center remains dark and barren. It is a reminder that the most dangerous demons aren't found in ancient books or dark forests, but in the hearts of those we trust. As the sun sets over the quiet trails of Manawat, the villagers still walk a little faster when they reach the grove of neem trees. They have learned that the familiar world can change in a heartbeat, and that sometimes the light of a flickering torch in a neighbor's window isn't a sign of welcome, but a warning of a debt that can only be paid in blood. Thousands of miles to the north, a different kind of fire was being fought in the dark, cold attic of a Hamburg tenement building. At 10 o'clock on a bright, dusty Tuesday morning in June of 1972, a 24-year-old miner named Elias was standing in a cramped, vibrating metal elevator cage. He was descending deep into the belly of the wanky No. 2 colliery in what was then Rhodesia. The air around him was thick with the scent of old grease and damp earth, but to Elias, this was just the smell of another Tuesday. He adjusted the heavy battery pack on his belt and shared a quick, tired grin with his partner, a man who had been working these seams since before Elias was born. The elevator cage dropped further, the light from the surface shrinking, until it was just a tiny distant square of white against the encroaching blackness of the shaft. Elias felt the familiar pressure in his ears and the sudden rise in temperature that always signaled they were nearing the working face. To anyone else, the idea of being hundreds of feet beneath the mountain would be terrifying, but Elias felt a profound sense of security in the darkness. The mine was a predictable world where the rules were simple and the brotherhood was absolute. Down here, it didn't matter where you were from or what language you spoke. In the flickering light of their headlamps, all 427 men on the morning shift were the same. They were fathers, sons, and breadwinners, united by the rhythmic clanging of the machinery and the shared goal of pulling the black gold from the earth to provide for their families. Elias stepped out of the cage and onto the dusty floor of the main haulage, with his boots crunching on the coal fragments as he began the long walk toward his section. The work was hard, physical, and relentless. Elias spent the first few hours of his shift in a state of focused concentration, operating the drills and loading the carts. The air was filled with the sound of grinding steel and the low, constant rumble of the conveyor belts. It was a sensory wall that he had learned to navigate with ease. He knew every shadow in the tunnels and every groan of the timber supports. He felt as though he could read the mountain like a book, and for 3 years that book had told him that he was safe. But as the morning wore on, Elias noticed something small, a detail that didn't fit the usual patterns of the mine. He was kneeling near a new ventilation duct, preparing to set a charge, when the air around him suddenly seemed to change. It wasn't a sound or a vibration, but a shift in the pressure against his eardrums. He stood up and looked at his partner, who was also standing still. Usually the air in the tunnels was moving a steady draft that pulled the dust away. Now the air was perfectly, unnervingly still. He wiped his forehead and took a deep breath, and that was when he smelled it. It wasn't the smell of coal or diesel, it was a faint, cloyingly sweet scent, almost like the smell of sun-dried grass in a summer field. In the mining world, that scent was a ghost, a whispered warning passed down through generations. It was the scent of methane, a gas that is normally odorless but sometimes carries a strange atmospheric sweetness before a disaster. Elias felt a sudden, sharp skip in his heart, a cold sensation that made the heat of the tunnel feel like ice. He looked up at the overhead lights, and he saw a strange shimmer in the air, a distortion like the heat haze on a highway. He opened his mouth to call out to the shift boss, but before the first word could leave his throat, the mountain decided it was tired of being quiet. A low, guttural roar began deep in the rock, a sound so powerful that it didn't just hit his ears, it hit his entire body. The floor beneath his boots turned into a liquid wave, and the darkness of the tunnel was suddenly replaced by a blinding, white-hot flash of energy. On the surface, a mile away from where Elias was standing, the disaster manifested as a massive, violent shudder of the earth. People in the village of Wanky felt their windows rattle and their dishes slide off the tables. They looked toward the mine and saw a sight that would be burned into their collective memory forever. A colossal pillar of black coal dust and debris shot hundreds of feet out of the main elevator shaft, looking like a dark volcanic eruption against the blue sky. The roar of the explosion could be heard for 20 miles. Within minutes, the gates of the colliery were swarmed by hundreds of women and children, their faces pale with terror. They stood in the dust-choked air, clinging to the chain-link fence and staring at the dark mouth of the shaft. There was no screaming yet, just a heavy, suffocating silence as the realization of what had happened began to settle over the community. They were looking at the entrance to a world that had suddenly become a tomb. The everyday fear of the mining life had finally realized its most horrific potential. A rescue coordinator named Daniel arrived at the scene 30 minutes after the blast. He was a veteran of industrial accidents, but as he stepped out of his truck and looked at the mangled steel of the headframe, he felt a weight in his stomach that he couldn't explain. The main access shafts were completely collapsed, and the ventilation system had been pulverized. He knew that the explosion had been fueled by methane and coal dust, a combination that creates an incinerator-like environment in a matter of seconds. He had to act fast, but he also had to act with cold, mechanical precision. Daniel led the first team of rescuers to the secondary ventilation shaft, the only remaining way into the mountain. They pulled on their heavy breathing apparatus and descended into the smoke. The air inside was a thick, black soup that their powerful flashlights couldn't penetrate. The heat was so intense that it felt like it was melting the rubber of their masks. As they reached the first level, they were met with a wall of toxic gas so concentrated that their meters began to shriek in warning. It was an invisible, silent killer that had filled every inch of the tunnels. They spent 4 hours trying to bypass the debris, their lungs burning and their muscles screaming from the exertion. Every time they thought they had found a path, a secondary explosion would rip through the lower levels, sending a shockwave of heat and rock toward them. Daniel had to make the agonizing call to pull his men back to the surface. He stood on the edge of the pit, looking at the readings on his gas monitor. The levels of carbon monoxide were so high that no human being could have survived for more than a few seconds after the initial blast. As the first night fell over the mountain, international help began to arrive. Specialized teams from South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States flew in with cutting-edge sonar equipment and high-tech sensors. They spent the next 48 hours drilling small pilot holes through the rock, trying to find any sign of life. They lowered microphones into the dark, listening for a rhythmic tapping, a voice, or even a groan. But the only thing that came back from the deep was the sound of the earth settling and the hissing of the toxic gas. Imagine if you were one of the family members standing at that fence, watching the experts shake their heads. You would be looking for any crumb of hope, any reason to believe that your husband or your son was sitting in a pocket of air waiting for you. You would replay the last thing they said to you that morning, wondering if you had hugged them long enough. But as the clock ticked past the 72-hour mark, the scientific reality began to overwhelm the human hope. The mountain was no longer a place of work. It was a scene of permanent loss. On the morning of the third day, Daniel sat in a high-stakes board meeting with the mining directors and the government officials. The data was indisputable. The gas levels throughout the entire mountain network had reached lethal concentrations, and the fires in the lower seams were still raging, consuming what little oxygen was left. The experts concluded that there was no one left to save. More importantly, the mine was now so unstable that any further rescue attempt would almost certainly result in the deaths of the surface teams. The mining board had to make a decision that is still discussed in industrial circles today. They had to decide when a rescue mission becomes a recovery mission and when a recovery mission becomes an impossibility. They looked at the maps, the gas readings, and the faces of the exhausted rescuers. With a heavy collective silence, they reached the verdict. They would not be bringing the 427 men home. The risk to the living was now greater than the duty to the dead. The mountain would be sealed. When the announcement was made to the families at the gate, the silence finally broke. It was replaced by a sound that Daniel would later describe as a primal roar of grief. He watched as women collapsed into the dust and men turned away to hide their tears. They weren't just being told that their loved ones were gone, they were being told that their bodies would never be recovered. Their graves were being defined by the very mountain that had provided their livelihood. It was a permanent, unrecovered loss that defied any sense of closure. The following day, the process of sealing the mine began. This wasn't a quick task. It was a massive engineering project designed to turn the colliery into a permanent, airtight tomb. Daniel stood by the main shaft as the first trucks of concrete arrived. He watched as the heavy gray liquid began to flow into the dark hole, a slow-moving river of finality. He thought about Elias and the hundreds of other men who were still down there, frozen in time, at the moment the mountain shuddered. He felt a profound sense of failure, despite knowing that he had done everything possible. The sealing took several days. They poured thousands of tons of concrete into the access shafts and used explosives to collapse the secondary entries. They were essentially creating a vacuum to starve the underground fires of oxygen. When the work was finished, the once bustling industrial site was a desert of gray stone and twisted metal. The only thing left was a large, flat concrete slab that covered the entrance to the number 2 shaft. It was a headstone that covered miles of subterranean tunnels, a monument that no one would ever be able to move. The Wankie coal mine disaster remains the deadliest industrial accident in the history of southern Africa. It left behind 427 widows and thousands of orphaned children, and it permanently altered the way the world looked at mining safety. But for the people who stayed in the village, the impact was more personal. They had to live in the shadow of the mountain every day, knowing that their fathers and brothers were still right there, resting in the silence just a few hundred feet beneath the soil they walked upon. The colliery eventually reopened in a different area, but the site of the number 2 shaft was never touched again. A small memorial was built near the concrete slab where the names of all 427 men were carved into the stone. Every year on June 6th, the families gather there to lay flowers on the gray concrete. There is no cemetery to visit, no headstone to clean. There is only the slab and the mountain. They have learned to live with a grief that is as solid and as permanent as the rock itself. The final haunting image that stays with the visitors to Wankie is the sight of that massive, weathered concrete slab in the middle of the quiet bush. It sits there like a silent, heavy weight on the earth, a place where the air still feels a little too still and the shadows seem a little too long. It is a reminder that the most dangerous traps are the ones we build for ourselves in the name of progress, and that sometimes the only thing the earth gives back is silence. It is a grave that spans an entire mountain, a tomb for a brotherhood that never saw the sun again. As the sun sets over the concrete headstone in Wanky, the focus of the world shifts from the deep dark shafts of a coal mine to the freezing sonar-pinged depths of the Finnish Sea, where a weighted canvas bag is finally ready to reveal a secret that has been waiting for 50 years to come to the surface. At 12 o'clock on a cool Tuesday in June of 1971, a 26-year-old lawyer named Ilpo Hermalainen was standing in the hallway of his apartment in Turku, Finland. The city outside was vibrant with the energy of early summer, the Baltic breeze carrying the scent of salt and blooming lilacs through the open windows. For Ilpo, life was a series of promising, well-ordered steps. He was a man who appreciated the clarity of the law and the solid foundation of a happy home. He adjusted his tie in the mirror and looked at his reflection. He was a young professional on the rise, recently established in his own practice, and he felt a profound sense of purpose. Behind him, he could hear the soft, rhythmic sounds of his wife Layla in the kitchen. She was preparing a small lunch for their infant son, who was just learning to sit up on his own. The apartment was filled with the warm golden light of the afternoon, and it felt like a fortress of security and love. Lila walked into the hallway, holding their son against her hip. She smiled at Ilpo, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. Ilpo reached out and gently squeezed the boy's tiny hand, feeling the soft, fragile strength of his grip. He told Layla he wouldn't be gone long, just a quick lunch meeting with a new client to discuss a complex real estate transaction. It was a lucrative opportunity that could secure their family's financial future for years to come. He was excited to get the deal started. He grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, the stitching still smelling of fresh craftsmanship, and tucked it under his arm. He gave Layla a quick, lingering kiss and stepped out into the hallway, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floor. As he walked down the stairs, he felt the cool, steady air of the building, a sense of total normality that he had come to take for granted. He was a man with a plan, a man with a family, and a man who truly believed in the world. Ilpo walked out into the street and took a deep breath of the fresh Turku air. He saw his neighbor watering the flower boxes and waved a friendly greeting. Everything was exactly as it should be. He began the short walk toward the city center, his mind already drifting to the legal details of the contract he was about to review. He felt a light, pleasant anticipation for the meeting. He never noticed that a dark, unremarkable car had pulled away from the curb just a few seconds after he did. He reached the designated meeting spot, a quiet, upscale cafe near the harbor. He checked his watch, 12:15. He was exactly on time. He looked around for his client, a charismatic advertising executive he had met only once before. The man had a reputation for being a visionary, someone who knew how to make things happen in the rapidly growing Finnish economy. Ilpo saw him sitting in a corner booth, waving him over with a wide, welcoming smile. It looked like a standard business lunch. But as Ilpo sat down and opened his briefcase, he noticed something small that didn't fit the professional atmosphere. His client wasn't looking at the documents, he was looking at the door, his eyes darting back and forth with a sharp, nervous energy. When the waitress arrived to take their order, the man didn't look at the menu. He simply asked for 2 black coffees and then leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. He told Ilpo that the real documents were on his boat. Ilpo felt a faint, flickering spark of unease. In his world of law and order, meetings took place in offices or cafes, not on private boats in the middle of a workday. He looked at the man's face, searching for a sign of a joke, but he saw only a strange, flat intensity in his eyes. He tried to use his professional logic to explain it away. Maybe the client was just being overly cautious about a high-value trade secret. Ilpo told himself he was being paranoid. He agreed to go to the harbor. They walked toward the docks, the sound of the seagulls overhead feeling unusually loud and piercing. Ilpo stepped onto the deck of the client's boat, a sturdy vessel that smelled of diesel and wet wood. As the engines roared to life and the boat began to pull away from the pier, Ilpo felt the vibration through his shoes. He looked back at the receding shoreline of Turku, watching as the colorful buildings shrank into the distance. He felt a sudden cold weight in his stomach. He was alone. Ilpo Hermalainen never returned to his apartment that night. When the clock struck 6 and the dinner Layla had prepared began to grow cold on the table, the peaceful world of their family started to crack. She called his office, but the secretary said he had left for lunch and never came back. She called the hospitals, the police, and his friends, her voice growing higher and more frantic with every dial. By midnight, she was sitting in the dark, clutching her son and staring at the door. The police investigation into Ilpo's disappearance was massive, but ultimately fruitless. They questioned the advertising executive who claimed that Ilpo had changed his mind at the last minute and asked to be dropped off at a different pier. Without a body, a weapon, or a witness, the case slowly began to cool. The seasons changed, the years turned into decades, and the file on Ilpo Hermalainen was moved to a dusty box in the back of the Turku evidence room. He became a ghost in the city. For 50 years, Layla and her son lived in a state of agonizing suspended animation. They had to learn to survive in the black hole left behind by Ilpo's absence. They never moved, they never changed the locks, and they never stopped looking at the faces in the crowd, hoping for a miracle. The everyday fear for them wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, crushing silence that lasted for half a century. They had to accept that the man they loved had simply evaporated from the earth. Imagine being that infant son growing into a man without ever knowing why your father left for a lunch meeting and never came home. You would grow up in a house where the air was always heavy with unasked questions and your mother's quiet, persistent grief. You would look at the only photograph of your father, a young man in a 1971 suit, and realize you are now twice as old as he was when he vanished. The mystery would be a permanent, invisible limb attached to your body. In the summer of 2021, a specialized cold case detective named Mikko was assigned to the file. He was a man who believed that time is the enemy of the killer, not the investigator. He spent weeks reading through the original handwritten notes from 1971. He found a small, overlooked detail in a witness statement, a mention of a heavy canvas bag that the advertising executive had been seen carrying toward his boat late on the night that Ilpo had vanished. Mikko realized that if the bag contained Ilpo, it was almost certainly resting at the bottom of the archipelago sea. He contacted a marine salvage team that utilized cutting-edge multi-beam sonar technology. They began a systematic scan of the seabed in a 3-mile radius from where the boat had been seen. For weeks, they found nothing but sunken logs and old tires. The search was expensive and grueling, and many in the department believed Mikko was chasing a complete and utter fantasy. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, exactly 50 years and 2 months after Ilpo walked out of his door, the sonar technician saw something. On the monitor, amidst the gray silt of the deep floor, was a distinct human-sized shape. It was a long, narrow rectangle that didn't look like a rock or a piece of wood. It had a strange, uniform texture that suggested man-made fabric. The sonar ping echoed through the cabin of the search boat, a rhythmic, haunting heartbeat from the deep sea. The team lowered a high-definition remote camera into the pitch-black, freezing water. As the light hit the seabed, the image on the screen cleared. It was a heavy, industrial-grade canvas bag weighted down with 2 large iron anchors. The fabric was perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor environment of the Baltic Sea. Even through the grainy camera feed, Mikko could see the shape of a person inside. The ghost of Turku had finally been found, resting in the absolute silence of the abyss. When the bag was carefully brought to the surface and opened in the forensic lab, the investigators were stunned. Because of the unique chemical composition of the deep Baltic water, Ilpo Hermalainen was almost perfectly preserved. He was still wearing his 1971 business suit, his tie still neatly knotted, and his leather briefcase still tucked near his side. He looked as if he had simply fallen asleep. Most importantly, his body still held the clues to his own murder. The medical examiner found a single, small-caliber bullet wound in the back of Ilpo's head. The professional business client hadn't just committed a fraud, he had performed an execution to cover up a series of forged real estate invoices that Ilpo was about to discover. Armed with this new forensic evidence, the police moved on the advertising executive, who was now an 80-year-old man living in a quiet retirement home. He had spent 50 years thinking he had gotten away with it. The arrest brought a final heavy sense of justice to the city of Turku. For Layla and her son, the truth was a devastating relief. They were finally able to give Ilpo a proper burial, ending the 50-year silence that had defined their lives. The advertising executive was convicted of the murder in 2022, becoming one of the oldest people in Finnish history to be sent to prison. The case proved that no matter how deep you bury a secret, the sea eventually speaks its name. The final haunting image that stays with you is the sight of that sonar screen showing a man who had been waiting in the dark for half a century to tell his story. Ilpo Hermalainen wasn't just a victim. He was a silent witness who refused to be erased. He sat on the floor of the sea, perfectly preserved in his suit, a reminder that the truth has a weight of its own. As the cold waters of the Baltic finally settled over the empty spot on the seabed, the sun was rising over an olive estate in Spain. At 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1975, the heat in the province of Seville was not just a weather condition, it was a physical weight. On the ancient olive oil estate of Los Galindos, the air was so still and so dry that every breath felt like inhaling fine, hot dust. For 66-year-old Manuel Zapata, the estate manager, this blinding white light was the familiar backdrop of a life dedicated to the soil and the rigid traditions of the Andalusian countryside. Manuel was a man of ironclad loyalty and meticulous habits. He had spent decades overseeing the thousands of olive trees that stretched toward the horizon like a silver-green sea. To him, Los Galindos was more than a workplace. It was a kingdom of order that he ruled with a heavy set of keys and a deep understanding of the land's secrets. He took a seat in his small, whitewashed cottage, the thick stone walls offering the only relief from the 40-degree sun beating down outside. Inside the quiet shade of the cottage, Manuel's wife Juana was busy with the small, comforting sounds of a household in its afternoon lull. The rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles and the occasional rustle of her apron were the only things breaking the silence. Manuel opened the heavy production logs for the olive oil harvest, his fingers tracing the columns of numbers with a practiced investigative eye. Everything seemed to be in its proper place, a perfect record of the estate's productivity. But as Manuel compared the internal logs to the external shipping receipts he had recently acquired, a small cold sensation began to bloom in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a slow, creeping suspicion that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The numbers didn't quite add up. There was a discrepancy, a missing volume of oil that should have filled hundreds of barrels. In his world, a missing liter of oil was a personal insult, a crack in the foundation of the trust he held. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning beneath him, and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He told himself it was likely just a clerical error, a simple mistake made by a tired clerk in the city. After all, the owners of Los Galindos were part of the Spanish elite people of immense wealth and social standing who lived far away in Seville and Madrid. They had no reason to skim from their own production. He closed the book and resolved to discuss the matter calmly later. He looked out the window at the shimmering heat haze rising from the dirt road. Usually, the only vehicles that approached the estate at this hour were the rusted tractors of the workers or the occasional supply truck. But as he watched, a flash of polished chrome caught his eye. A luxury black sedan was moving slowly up the driveway, its dark windows reflecting the sun like obsidian. Manuel stood up his joints, protesting with a dull ache. It was far too early for a scheduled visit. He walked toward the door, telling Juana he would be back in a moment. As he stepped out onto the porch, the heat hit him like a physical blow, making his vision swim for a split second. He adjusted his cap and watched the car come to a halt in front of the main house. The engine cut out, and for a long moment, nobody emerged. The silence of the estate felt different now, no longer peaceful, but heavy and expectant, as if the thousands of olive trees were all holding their collective breath. Finally, the rear door of the sedan opened and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp, expensive suit that looked entirely out of place in the dusty rural setting. He didn't wave or call out a greeting, he just stood there, looking toward the manager's cottage with an unreadable expression. Manuel felt a sharp spike of unease. He knew this man. He was a high-ranking administrator for the owners, someone who only appeared when there was a significant problem to be solved or a secret kept. Manuel began to walk toward the main house, his leather boots crunching rhythmically on the dry gravel. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to go back inside and lock the door, a primal instinct that screamed of an approaching storm. But his sense of duty was stronger than his fear. He had been the manager of Los Galindos for decades, and he would not show weakness now. He reached the man in the suit and offered a stiff, formal nod, asking what had brought such a guest on such a day. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked around the courtyard, his eyes lingering on the heavy iron tools leaning against the barn and the stacks of empty crates. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth and calm, devoid of any warmth. He said they needed to discuss the production logs Manuel had been reviewing. He mentioned that some corrections were being made to the records, and that it would be best if Manuel handed over his personal ledgers for safekeeping. It was a cold demand. Manuel felt his face flush, not from the heat, but from a sudden surge of indignation. He told the man that his ledgers were accurate and that he had a responsibility to ensure every drop of oil was accounted for. He mentioned the discrepancies he had found and suggested that perhaps an independent audit was necessary. The man in the suit didn't flinch. He just looked at Manuel with a strange, pitying look, as if he were looking at a relic of a world that was already dead. He walked inside. Confused and frustrated, Manuel followed him into the cool, dark interior of the estate's main building. He expected a long negotiation, perhaps even a heated argument about the accounts. But as they entered the large stone-floored library, Manuel realized he was not alone with the administrator. 3 other men were standing in the shadows of the bookshelves. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing the rough, practical clothing of hired help, and their hands were not empty. Imagine the sheer terror that would flood your system in that moment. You are a man who has lived by the rules your entire life, standing in the heart of the kingdom you have guarded for years, only to realize that the king has sent his executioners. Manuel's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his throat went completely dry. He tried to turn back toward the door, but the man in the suit was already standing in the way, his face a mask of cold indifference. The first blow from the heavy iron tool hit Manuel in the side of the head before he could even raise his hands to defend himself. He fell to the floor, the cold stone against his cheek, a shocking contrast to the heat outside. As he struggled to breathe, he heard the sounds of the other men moving through the house. They weren't looking for money or valuables, they were looking for witnesses. He thought of Juana back in the cottage, and he felt a grief so profound it overshadowed the pain. Hours later, at 5 o'clock in the evening, a neighbor from a nearby farm noticed a thick column of black smoke rising from the direction of Los Galindos. At first, he thought it was just a controlled burn of olive branches, but the smoke was too dark and too oily. He jumped on his tractor and raced toward the estate, his heart racing with a premonition of disaster. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw that one of the workers' cottages was engulfed in flames. He shouted, but no one answered. When the local volunteer fire department arrived and managed to douse the flames, they made a discovery that would haunt the village of Paradas for generations. Inside the charred remains of the cottage were the bodies of a young worker and his wife, both executed before the fire was set. The investigators began a desperate search of the sprawling grounds, their boots kicking up clouds of white dust. They found a tractor driver named Ramon lying dead in an olive grove shot as he tried to flee. But the true horror was found inside the main house. Manuel Zapata was discovered in the library, his head bludgeoned with a force that suggested a coordinated rage. His wife Juana was found in a nearby room, her life ended with the same brutal tool. The scene was a chaotic nightmare, but to the investigators, it was also a message. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a systematic purge. 5 people had been murdered in a quiet afternoon, and yet not a single witness could be found. The initial investigation into the Los Galindos massacre was a disaster of historic proportions. High-ranking military and civil guard officials arrived on the scene within hours, but instead of securing the evidence, they seemed more interested in controlling the narrative. Locals were allowed to walk all over the crime scene, trampling fingerprints and destroying vital forensic traces. Vital documents from Manuel's office vanished, and the production logs were never seen again. It was a cover-up. The massacre occurred during Spain's delicate transition to democracy after the death of the dictator Francisco Franco. In this volatile political environment, the last thing the government wanted was a scandal involving the landed elite and systemic corruption in the olive oil industry. The case was shuffled between courts, evidence was lost in transit, and potential leads were ignored. The fear for the survivors was the realization that the law offered them no protection against the powerful. Decades passed, and the Los Galindos massacre became a dark legend in Andalusia. Every few years, a new investigator would take a look at the file, hoping to find the detail that everyone else had missed. They interviewed the aging marquis who owned the estate, but he maintained a wall of aristocratic silence. They analyzed the forensic reports from 1975, realizing that the murders had occurred hours apart, pointing to a coordinated plot that required multiple killers and orders. In the early 2000s, a declassified dossier revealed the true scale of the fraud Manuel had uncovered. It wasn't just a few barrels of oil, it was a massive multi-million-dollar scheme involving ghost shipments and state subsidies. Manuel Zapata had been a man of integrity in a system built on secrets, and his refusal to look the other way had cost him and 4 other people their lives. The killers were never caught, and the mastermind remained shielded by a web of social influence. Today, the Los Galindos estate still stands, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun. To a traveler driving past, it looks like a peaceful, productive farm, a beautiful example of traditional Spanish agriculture. But for the people of Paradas, the estate is a monument to a silence that has never been broken. They know that the blood in the library was never truly washed away, it was just covered with a new layer of paint. They have learned that in a world of silver trees, the most dangerous secrets stay. The final haunting image that stays with you is the sight of the estate at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the heat is at its peak and the cicadas are screaming in the trees. The dirt road is empty and the air is perfectly still. You find yourself looking toward the horizon, half expecting to see a black luxury sedan moving slowly through the shimmering haze. It is a reminder that justice is not always a guarantee, and that sometimes the only thing the land remembers is the weight of secrets. As the shadows lengthen over the white walls of Los Galindos, the focus of the world shifts across the Pacific to the dense, rainy forests of Vancouver Island, where a different kind of genius was about to leave a note and walk into a storm, from which he would never return. He had spent months welding the hull of a handmade spacecraft in his backyard, telling friends he was receiving signals from the stars, and on a night when the wind was strong enough to snap cedar trees, he simply evaporated. At 6 o'clock in the evening on a stormy Saturday in late November of 1980, a 32-year-old man named Granger Taylor was sitting at his kitchen table in the quiet town of Duncan, British Columbia. Outside, a massive Pacific Northwest storm was screaming through the Douglas firs, lashing the windows with a freezing rain that felt like a wall of ice. For Granger, this blinding white noise was just a background hum. He was focused on a short handwritten note he was carefully placing in the center of the wooden table. In the tight-knit community of Vancouver Island, Granger was a local legend. He wasn't famous for his social standing, but for his hands. Granger was a mechanical wizard. He could look at a rusted, seized engine that had been sitting in a field for 40 years, and without a single blueprint or manual, bring it back to life with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. He was a man of very few words, preferring the honest, logical feedback of gears and pistons to the messy unpredictability of human conversation. Neighbors would bring him their broken tractors, their seized chainsaws, and their failing trucks, and Granger would simply walk around the machine, once touch the cold steel, and know exactly where the friction was hiding. To Granger, the world was a series of mechanical systems that could always be repaired if you just understood the language of the metal. For over a decade, his life followed a peaceful, predictable orbit on his parents' farm, where he spent every waking hour in his large corrugated metal workshop. He was a well-loved fixture of the town, an eccentric genius who was always ready to help a neighbor in need. But as the 1970s drew to a close, the focus of his mechanical brilliance began to shift in a way that left the community uneasy. He stopped working on the local tractors. He stopped taking commissions for engine repairs. He became obsessed with a different kind of machine, one that didn't run on diesel or gasoline, but on the very fabric of the universe itself far beyond the valley. In a large, muddy field behind his parents' house, Granger began to build something that defied every convention of rural Canadian life. Using massive sheets of curved steel and spare aircraft parts he had salvaged from local scrapyards, he constructed a full-sized, double-walled flying saucer. It was a shimmering silver dome that sat on the wet grass like a fallen star. Granger spent every night inside it, welding, wiring, and installing a series of complex handmade control panels that no one understood. At first, the townspeople just smiled and shook their heads, figuring it was just another one of Granger's elaborate hobbies. His parents were supportive even as they watched their son move a couch and a television into the metal craft. Granger told them he found the acoustics inside the steel hull to be more soothing than the farmhouse. He began to spend his nights sleeping within the dome, tucked away from the mundane concerns of the world and the quiet, predictable rhythm of the farming community. But as the winter of 1980 approached, the wizard began to change in ways that his mechanical skills couldn't explain. He started telling his friends in his quiet, matter-of-fact voice that he had begun receiving telepathic communications from extraterrestrial entities. He claimed they were teaching him the secrets of deep space propulsion, providing him with mental blueprints that bypassed human physics. He didn't sound like a man losing his mind. He sounded like a man who found a new set of instructions. On the night of the storm, as the wind was snapping massive cedar branches and turning the dirt roads into rivers of gray slurry, Granger walked into the kitchen wearing his heavy work jacket. He looked unusually calm, his eyes bright with a strange internal light that his parents had never seen before. He told them he was going for a short walk to check on something in the shop. He didn't hug them or say a formal goodbye. He just gave them a quick, polite nod and stepped out into the freezing rain. His father watched from the window as Granger's large, bright pink pickup truck roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness like twin sabers as the vehicle pulled out of the driveway and disappeared into the wall of water. It was the last time anyone would see Granger Taylor or his truck. The next morning, when the storm had passed, his mother walked out to the saucer to call him for breakfast. The metal door was swinging open in the wind, but the interior was completely empty and silent. On the small table where Granger usually kept his technical notebooks, she found the note he had been writing. It was written with the same clinical precision as his engine diagrams. It stated that he was embarking on a 42-year voyage aboard an alien spacecraft to explore the vastness of the stars. The note asked his family to not worry and explained that he would return exactly 42 years from that date. It was a bizarre document that felt like a suicide note and a travel itinerary. Panic immediately set in. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were called, and a massive search was launched across the rugged terrain of Vancouver Island. Hundreds of volunteers combed the dense forests and the treacherous coastline, looking for a 32-year-old man and a massive, distinct pink pickup truck. In the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, things usually stay found once you start looking. A truck that size, painted in such a vivid neon pink color, should have been easy to spot. But as the weeks turned into months, the searchers found absolutely nothing. There were no tire tracks leading off a cliff, no submerged wreckage in the dark rivers, and no sign of a campfire in the woods. It was as if Granger Taylor and his 3-ton vehicle had simply evaporated into the humid air. The everyday fear for the community of Duncan was the realization that a brilliant, capable man could just step out of his known reality and vanish without leaving a single forensic trace in his wake. For years, the case remained a black hole in the local history. Some people believed Granger had suffered a severe psychological break and had driven into the deep ocean. Others, remembering his uncanny mechanical genius, wondered if he had truly found a way to bridge the gap between our world and something far beyond the stars. His parents refused to believe he was dead, keeping his workshop exactly as he had left it for decades, waiting for the 42-year window to finally close. They looked at the calendar every day, holding on to the hope that the voyage was real and that their son was simply moving through a time and space they couldn't comprehend. They left the porch light on every single night, a small, lonely beacon in the dark, for a traveler who had gone further than anyone else in the valley. The mystery took a dark, physical turn in 1986, 6 years after the disappearance, when a group of loggers discovered a small blast site on a remote mountain. In the center of a blackened circle of earth, they found several rusted fragments of metal that appeared to belong to a vehicle chassis. They also found a few tiny scorched bone fragments. The initial theory was that Granger had used dynamite to end his own life, as he had been known to carry explosives for clearing stumps on the farm. But the forensic evidence was far from conclusive. The metal fragments were too degraded to be identified, and the bone fragments were too small for DNA testing. Furthermore, there was no explanation for why his truck would be on that specific inaccessible ridge, or why he would have spent months building a saucer only to use a stick of dynamite in the middle of a forest. For those who knew him, the blast site didn't feel like the end of the story. It felt like a distraction, a mechanical riddle left behind by a man who was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. It was a conclusion that lacked the elegant, balanced logic of his usual mechanical work. As the decades passed, Granger Taylor became a ghost story for the children of Vancouver Island. People would drive past the Taylor farm and point at the silver dome sitting in the field, whispering about the man who went to the stars. The local authorities eventually closed the file, marking it as an unresolved disappearance, but the community never truly let go of the mystery. They were haunted by the image of the pink truck driving into the storm, a vivid flash of color in a gray and rainy world. The 42-year deadline mentioned in Granger's note finally arrived in late 2022. The town of Duncan held its breath, and the story went viral around the world. People looked toward the silver saucer in the backyard, half expecting the heavy metal door to creak open once again. They imagined Granger stepping out, looking exactly as he did in 1980, ready to describe the wonders of the deep cosmos. But as the date passed and the sun set in the valley, the silence remained. No pink truck drove up the driveway, and no genius mechanic returned to explain the secrets of the universe. The voyage, it seemed, was permanent. The Taylor family, who had waited with such quiet, persistent hope, were left with the same empty field and the same silver dome. The passing of the date didn't bring closure. It only deepened the mystery of where Granger had gone and what he had found on that stormy night so many years ago. It was the final silent period at the end of a long sentence. Today, the saucer still sits in the field, its silver paint faded, and its interior filled with dust and cobwebs. It has become a monument to a mystery that refuses to be solved, a physical manifestation of the thin line between isolated technical genius and a profound, quiet delusion. The case remains one of Canada's most haunting stories, a narrative that challenges our understanding of what it means to truly vanish. He didn't just leave the town, he wrote a script for his departure and then followed it. The final haunting image that stays with you is the site of Granger's workshop on a rainy night. The blueprints for the spacecraft are still pinned to the wall, their ink fading, but the lines still sharp and clear. The tools are laid out in their proper places on the workbench, waiting for a master who knew how to speak the language of the machine. It is a room filled with potential, a place where a man once believed he could weld a path to the stars, leaving behind a world that was far too heavy. As the rain continues to lash against the metal roof in Duncan, the silence of the workshop serves as a reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by logic or forensic science. They exist in the spaces between what we know and what we imagine. Granger Taylor may be resting in the soil of a remote mountain ridge, or he may be moving through the vastness of the stars exactly where he said he would be. But in the quiet valley of Vancouver Island, he remains a ghost in a bright pink truck. He is a reminder that the world is much larger and more mysterious than we often care to admit. He proved that even in the most ordinary of lives, there is a door that can open into the unknown, and once you step through it, there is no guarantee that you will ever find your way back. As the wind screams through the Douglas firs and the shadows gather in the corners of the shed, the story of Granger Taylor remains a whispered warning to anyone who dares to look too closely at the shimmering stars. The pink truck is gone, the mechanic is gone, and the silver saucer is empty. But the legend of the 42-year voyage lives on in the quiet, humid air of the Pacific Northwest. It is a story about the power of the mind and the absolute finality of a choice made in the dark. Granger Taylor didn't just disappear, he invited the universe to take him home. And as the storm of 1980 faded into memory, he left behind a world that would never stop wondering where he was. When we look back at the 12 journeys we have taken today, a single chilling realization begins to surface through the fog of these disparate events. We often tell ourselves that the world is a predictable place governed by a set of logical B rules and communal protections that keep the darkness at bay. We walk through our daily routines, believing that as long as we follow the path, we are safe within our homes and our neighborhoods. But these stories from the 1970s prove that the path is much thinner than we dare to imagine. This was a decade defined by immense cultural shifts and the rise of modern technology, yet beneath that gleaming surface, the same ancient primal fears were still breathing. We have seen how a routine afternoon on a farm, a simple lunch meeting, or even a quiet night in a brand new suburban home can suddenly fracture into a nightmare that leaves no room for escape. The story of Fritz Honka in Hamburg serves as a profound and terrifying lesson in the danger of social invisibility. In a bustling city, it is easy to assume that our neighbors are just like us, leading lives of quiet and harmless routine. But Honka flourished in the gaps created by urban indifference. He chose victims who had already been discarded by society, knowing that their absence would go unnoticed. He hid his horrors behind the most mundane objects, tiny green air fresheners. It forces us to ask how many other secrets are currently hidden behind the closed doors of our own apartment buildings. We walk past people every day without ever knowing the darkness they carry or the voids they have created within their own walls. Honka wasn't a monster from a movie. He was the pathetic man at the corner of the bar. His story reflects a failure of the communal gaze, a reminder that when we stop looking out for the vulnerable, the monsters move in. Similarly, the case of Carlos Robledo Puig in Argentina challenges our fundamental biases about what evil actually looks like. We are conditioned to look for the scarred, the aggressive, and the marginalized when we imagine a predator. Carlos had the face of an angel and the upbringing of a gentleman, yet he committed atrocities for the sheer adrenaline of the act. His beauty was a shield that blinded everyone to the cold, dark void that occupied the center of his soul. Society wants to believe that goodness and beauty are linked, but the angel of death proved that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we are most inclined to trust. He exploited the very stereotypes that were meant to protect the public. When we prioritize appearance over behavior, we create a sanctuary for those who wish us harm. It is a haunting reflection on how easily our perceptions can be manipulated by a soft voice and a mass of golden innocent curls. In India, the Manawat ritual murders reveal a different kind of rot, the weaponization of ancient superstition by those with modern education and wealth. It is easy to blame the horrific acts on primitive beliefs, but the true driver was the calculated greed of the elite. Rukmini and her husband didn't kill because they were uneducated. They killed because they viewed human lives as ritual currency to solve their financial problems. They treated their neighbors as livestock. This reflects a recurring theme in many of our stories today, the profound danger that emerges when those in power view the lives of others as a resource to be spent. Whether it is a wealthy couple in a rural village or a group of shipping executives in South Korea, the result is the same. When the bottom line or the pursuit of status becomes more important than the pulse of a human being, the everyday world transforms into a factory of cold mechanical slaughter. The tragedy of the Namyang-ho ferry is a staggering example of this institutional betrayal. 326 people vanished into the freezing sea because a few individuals decided that safety protocols were an unnecessary expense. They traded V life jackets for orange crates and radios for tax savings. The image of those millions of oranges bobbing on the surface is a vibrant, heartbreaking memorial to the human cost of a corporate culture that values profit over people. It is a story that repeats itself in the dark shafts of the Wanky coal mine in Rhodesia. There, 427 men were entombed forever because the risk of a rescue was deemed too high for the company to bear. While the technical logic may have been sound, the human weight of that decision is almost impossible to carry. The mountain became a permanent, unrecovered grave, a silent monument to the fathers and sons who were left behind in the name of stability. We also have to confront the heavy mantle of state secrecy that defined the Cold War, as seen in the tragic sinking of the Kate submarine. 52 men died not just because of a fire, but because their own government valued military silence more than their survival. They were martyrs for a secret, and their families were left with a lie for decades. It is a sobering reflection on the way national interests can often act as a crushing weight on the lives of individual sailors. The common thread in these disasters is the loss of closure. For the families of the miners in Wanky or the sailors of the Kate, the grief is frozen in time. There is no body to bury and no grave to visit. They are left with a permanent gaping hole in their lives that can never be filled. This lack of finality is perhaps the most visceral fear of all the fear that our loved ones could simply evaporate into the machinery of a system that refuses to acknowledge its own failure. However, the stories of the Sanchong Ditch and the Turku Sea offer a small, persistent light in that darkness. They show us that the truth has a patient, ironclad resilience that eventually defies the passage of time. In Taiwan, a tiny indigo tattoo of a bird and a length of industrial rope were enough to give a nameless victim back her identity. It reminds us that even when someone is treated like waste, the fragments of who they were can still reach out to demand justice. In Finland, the discovery of Ilpo Hermelainen after 50 years is a testament to the fact that no secret is ever truly buried deep enough. The sea preserved him in his suit, holding on to his briefcase and the evidence of his murder for half a century. It is a powerful image of the long game of justice. It tells us that while the wicked may enjoy decades of silence, the earth and the water are always watching, waiting for the moment when the truth is ready to come home. Yet, as we saw with the Los Galindos estate in Spain, justice is not always a guarantee in our world. Sometimes the web of corruption and social influence is so thick that the truth remains trapped beneath the soil forever. The massacre of those 5 workers is a haunting reminder that power can shield the guilty and silence the cries of the dead. For the people of Paradas, the estate is a beautiful landscape that hides a dark, permanent stain that the law refused to clean. It leaves us with a profound sense of unease about the institutions that are supposed to protect us. If a massacre can occur in broad daylight on a prestigious estate and remain unsolved for 50 years, what does that say about the integrity of the system? It suggests that in the 1970s, as in any era, there were 2 versions of reality. One for those who follow the rules and another for those who write them. It is a chilling reflection on the nature of systemic truth. And then we have the case of Granger Taylor on Vancouver Island, a story that sits in the strange, melancholic space between technical genius and total mystery. Granger didn't wait for the world to fail him, he simply decided to leave it on his own terms. Whether he truly found a way to the stars or met a tragic end on a remote mountain ridge, his departure was a masterpiece of self-erasure. He left behind a note and a silver saucer that still haunts the community decades later. His story reflects the human desire to transcend the limitations of our ordinary lives. We all feel the weight of the world at times, the pressure of a routine that can feel like a trap. Granger Taylor was a man who spoke the language of machines, but he was searching for a conversation with the infinite. His disappearance is the final, ultimate, haunting image. A bright pink truck driving into a storm and vanishing into a mystery that no amount of logic can ever fully resolve. As we conclude this journey through these 12 dark chapters of human history, we are left with a quiet, persistent chill. We have seen the face of evil in a golden-haired boy, the crushing weight of institutional greed in the Korea Strait, and the patient silence of a man waiting at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. We have seen how ordinary life can fracture in a heartbeat, leaving behind nothing but a series of questions and a lingering sense of atmospheric dread. These stories are not just reports of the past, they are warnings for the present. They remind us to look a little closer at the world around us and to never take the safety of our routines for granted. They teach us that the most important details are often the smallest ones, a green rope, a tiny tattoo, or a smell of pine that doesn't belong in a hallway. They show us that while we may live in a world of light, the shadows are always moving, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Thank you for sitting with me tonight and listening to these stories. It is a heavy thing to carry the weight of these memories, but it is a necessary one if we are to honor the people who were caught in these traps. As you go about your week, remember the lessons we have shared. Be diligent, be observant, and most importantly, be kind to those who may be struggling in the shadows of the world. The bonds we build with each other are the only true protection we have. As always, make sure your doors are bolted tonight. Check the window latches one more time before you go to sleep. If you have security cameras, take a quick look at the feed to make sure the darkness outside is exactly what it seems to be. And if you notice a small wrong detail in your own home, a door left ajar or a sound in the attic, do not ignore it. Trust your instincts, for they are the oldest tools of survival we possess in a world that can change in a heartbeat. I will be back soon with more stories from the dark corners of the earth. Until then, keep the lights on, stay curious, and stay safe. The world is a much larger and more mysterious place than we often care to admit, and the journey into the unknown is one we all must take eventually. But for tonight, the stories are over and the silence has returned. Good night, and may your dreams be far more peaceful than the reality we have explored together in the dark.